morning, everyone. Hello, good morning. Buenos dias, buen dia. Thank you so much for coming here today, and thanks to everyone who's joining us online. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us for this conference, which I'm sure is going to be 2 days of inspiring, enriching and motivating presentations, discussions and encounters. My name's Ave Ribbons. I'm the Academic Activities Manager at the Johns Hopkins University Universitat Pompeu Fabra Public Policy Center. And I've been the Managing Editor of the International Journal of Social Determinants of Health and Health Services since 2018. And I'm honored to welcome you today to the first ever Rethinking the Eco-Social Determinants of Health Inequities through the Transdisciplinary and Intersectoral Lens European Conference, or SD, as we're calling it, because if we had to say the full name, this conference would last 5 days. I believe that many of us are here today. I believe many of us here today are present because we feel a call for social justice in response to the housing crisis that is plaguing cities across the world, the lack of political action in the face of the climate crisis, the disproportionate influence that transnational corporations hold over decision makers, the hostile treatment of migrants that come to Europe in search of safety, or the lack of stable and fair employment. And now, more than ever, the denial of health caused by wars and genocides in various parts of the globe. In fact, sorry to start it with a negative note, but by the time we finish today, around 20 families will have been evicted from their homes in Catalonia. Around 10 people of London will have died due to pollution-related illnesses. Around 6 migrants will have died or gone missing in the Mediterranean trying to reach Europe. And approximately 1,600 children under 5 will have died from extreme hunger and malnutrition caused by conflict, mainly in Yemen, Sudan, Gaza, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the hardest fact is that all of this is completely avoidable. But that's exactly why we're here today. The urgency of this situation compels us to comprehensively understand why these situations occur in all their breadth and complexity, and to search for real solutions, because all of our lives are affected by the eco-social determinants of health. So this is the invitation over these next 2 days, to pause and rethink the root causes of health inequities and their social and political solutions in the context of the acute eco-social crisis that we're living through, with the help of the many reflections that will be shared during the event. We'll be going beyond the traditional siloed academic approaches to research and coming together as people from diverse backgrounds, professions, disciplines, and countries to critically rethink the eco-social determinants of health inequities and create cutting-edge new proposals for creating a more just and equal world. Thank you so much for coming, and without further ado, I'm giving the stage to Dr. Aida Solé, the Vice Rector of Students and Alumni at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Bon dia a tothom. It is a great honor to welcome you to this European Conference on Rethinking the Eco-Social Determinants of Health Inequities. Our rector cannot join us today due to prior commitments, but she sends her sincere apologies for her absence. As a professor in the Department of Political and Social Sciences, as well as Joan Benach, I would also like to extend my apologies, or the apologies, on behalf of our department director, Clara Cortina, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, to welcome you all to this great conference. We are deeply grateful to the Johns Hopkins University and the UPF Public Policy Center for their outstanding leadership in organizing this timely and significant event. The topics that you are addressing, which mainly can be summarized in environmental and health challenges, are closely aligned with the EU current priorities and represent some of the most urgent and complex issues in our time. This transdisciplinary, intersectional, transnational approach of this conference is essential for developing innovative and effective responses. By bringing together scholars, public health experts, policymakers, and civil society, this event creates a unique space for dialogue and also great collaboration. It is through such collaboration efforts that we can hope to tackle the structural roots of health inequities and promote also the well-being of our society. Pompeu Fabra University is also aligned with this objective, the objective that you have in these conferences. And we recognize the importance of integrating knowledge across disciplines and also different sectors to foster sustainable solutions that are just and also equitable. We look forward to the rich discussions that you will have in the following 2 days, inspiring keynote speakers, and also fruitful workshops that will take place in this room in the next 2 days, as I said. So thank you all for your commitment. Thank you for the leadership, and thank you for advancing in this important area of research. I wish you all a productive, stimulating, and also an inspiring conference. So enjoy the conference and also enjoy, if possible, Barcelona. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your words, Dr. Solé. I'm now pleased to invite Mrs. Claudie Faltisova, Project Advisor at the European Health and Digital Executive Agency, to the stage. Welcome, Claudie.
Good morning, everyone. Also from my side, a huge welcome, all of you. And I would like to say that it's really a pleasure to be here with you for these 2 days. As said, I'm Claudia Faltisova. I'm a project advisor working at the Health and Digital Executive Agency. The abbreviation is HADEA. I don't know if you all know this agency, but it's one of the executive agencies implementing EU programs on behalf of the European Commission. And this one concretely is the EU for Health program, which is also co-financing this event, this conference. And I would like to say that we are really happy that we can contribute and co-finance such an important event. I will not repeat the whole name, it was already said, and it's a long name, but also we feel that this theme is a really important one and very timely topic. It's everything what we see is going on around us. And so, yeah, so we are really happy that we can contribute to something meaningful, which hopefully, and I wish for, will have an impact, and not only these 2 days, during these 2 days, but also beyond these 2 days, beyond this conference, and might hopefully have an impact on everyday lives of as many people as possible, and will finally contribute to reducing some health inequalities. So I'm really looking forward to all the speeches, to the workshops. I really like that it seems to be a very interactive conference, and also to the call to action at the end of the conference. And yeah, I will not take too much time because there are other people who are more knowledgeable of the topic than me, but I would like to wish us all a very fruitful, interesting and inspiring meeting. And thank you again for having me here.
Thank you so much, Claudie. And thank you for all of your valuable support and guidance throughout this project. It's been, yeah, really great having you accompanying us during this process. So finally, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Ms. Stephanie Carrignum, Associate Director of the Health in All Policies Initiative and Senior Program Manager of the Institute for Health and Social Policy at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, who's traveled from the United States to be with us today. So welcome, Stephanie.
Yes, thank you. It's such a hardship to come here to Barcelona in these beautiful days. Exactly. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Stephanie Kerrigan, the Associate Director of the Health in All Policies Initiative at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And it's my honor to welcome you to this important gathering on behalf of Dr. Keisha Pollock-Porter, who's the co-director of the Johns Hopkins University and Universitat Pompeu Fabra Public Policy Center, please forgive my pronunciation, who unfortunately is unable to join us today. Keisha thanks you for being here and extends a warm welcome to everyone who is taking part in ESDHI. She wishes you a great conference and hopes that you are challenged, learn new things, and build new connections with colleagues. I'm so excited to meet and work with you all over these 2 days. Whether you're a policymaker, a community advocate, a student, or a researcher, your presence reflects a shared commitment to advance health equity by addressing the eco-social determinants of health, especially in the context of multiple environmental, political, and social inflection points we're experiencing today. At the Health in All Policies Initiative at Hopkins, we share the same goal. We understand that health is not an isolated matter and that it depends on much more than our biology and choices. Our health depends on our environment, the quality of our homes, the safety of our neighborhoods, access to affordable and healthy food, and our ability to live a life free of oppression and discrimination. We often say that zip code matters more for your health than genetic code. And in the US, for example, residents living in the wealthiest 1% of US counties have an average life expectancy of 84.3 years, while those in the bottom 50% average 77.4 years. That's a 7-year difference. In Loudoun County, Virginia, close to my home in DC, life expectancy is 84 years, whereas in McDowell County, West Virginia, it's just 69 years. That's a 15-year difference within 350 miles, which in the US, that's not a great distance. This is why we're working to encourage policymakers to include health impact assessments and health protections in all kinds of public policies. Housing, transportation, labor, food, urban design, and more, so that all members of society are able to live a healthy life. The initiative is based on partnerships between research and practice, with a focus on pushing for real, tangible change in communities. It's not easy to be doing this work at this time, especially in the context of great uncertainty and political upheaval. But this is why today's conference is so exciting. It's about more than ideas, it's about action. It's about identifying what works and scaling it. It's about challenging what doesn't and creating space for equity-driven innovation. I'm looking forward to hearing about the different projects and research initiatives that are being carried out to tackle health inequities in Europe, and working with you all to imagine and design bold new initiatives that can transform the current state of affairs. Health equity is not a distant ideal, it's a collective moral responsibility. I hope that this gathering energizes each of us to go forward with new ideas, relationships, and the motivation to tackle eco-social determinants of health inequities. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. I look forward to talking with all of you.
Thank you so much to Ida, Claudie, and Stephanie for your motivating and supportive words as we open this conference. So we're now going to start the first session of today. So I'd like to invite Joan Benach, Wendy Harcourt, and Sonia Ruiz to the stage for today's first session. Please take a seat at the table. The first 2 keynote speeches of today will introduce and explore the 2 approaches that are crucial for 2 of the approaches that are crucial for successfully understanding and tackling the eco-social determinants of health inequities, especially in the current context: transdisciplinarity and feminism. This session will be moderated by Sonia Ruiz Garcia. Sonia is a political scientist with expertise in feminism, equality, public policy, and labor, and holds academic degrees from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She's worked as a policy officer for the European Women's Lobby in Brussels, served as a political advisor in the Spanish ministerial cabinets, and was a postdoctoral research fellow at Oxford Brookes University. Sonia's published widely whilst teaching both academic and practitioner audiences, and she currently coordinates the area of feminism and equality in the provincial government of Barcelona, while continuing her active engagement in feminist and community activism. Sonia, thank you so much for joining us today and for moderating this session. Over to you. Joan.
Thank you very much. Bon dia a tots y a totes. Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here today. There are moments, especially in times of social care, economic and ecological crisis, such as those we are currently experiencing, when certain voices do more than just analyze the world. They remind us of what truly matters. Titled Beyond the Eco-Social Determinants of Health, Transdisciplinary and Feminist Perspectives, this opening panel, featuring two outstanding keynote speakers, offers us more than just analysis. It invites us to explore ways forward and new pathways to transform it. Professor Joan Benach, through his rigorous and committed work in critical public health, shows us how precarity, unjust labor conditions, and neoliberal policies leave deep marks on our bodies and minds. Yet he also reveals how science, when grounded in ethics and social responsibility, can become a powerful act of resistance. Professor Wendy Harcourt, with her deeply feminist and eco-social voice, invites us to listen to alternatives, ways of thinking and living and knowing. She brings forward the stories of those who resist multiple crises, not with theory alone, but through everyday practices, care work, solidarity economies, and sustainable territories. Both speakers remind us that data and statistics are not incompatible with care and tenderness. The research itself must be an act of justice and hope. It is a privilege to introduce two individuals who, while coming from different academic backgrounds, meet in a shared horizon, one in which transforming the world means leaving no one behind and working toward more equitable, sustainable, and livable futures. In the context of this panel, this shared horizon speaks directly to the eco-social determinants of health, a field very well known for you all here that not only seeks to understand the root causes of health inequalities, but also demands transformative action through engaged, systemic, and justice-centered approaches. Both speakers call for radical change and articulate pathways to a new paradigm, one that mobilizes social organizations, academia, and governments in pursuit of social justice and ecological sustainability. My sincerest congratulations to the conference organizers, who I know have worked thoughtfully and with great dedication for launching this event with such a powerful and inspiring first panel. You have truly succeeded in creating a space where Professors Benach and Harcourt can engage in rich, meaningful dialogue, and with all of you, I'm sure about that. So, how do we go beyond the analysis of the eco-social determinants of health? This panel suggests that we do so by embracing the methods, the principles, and transformative capacity of transdisciplinarity and feminism. Both approaches, both speakers, resonate with the principles of degrowth and share at least 5 central commitments, or potentialities that I would like to draw from their proposals and in order to finish this introduction. The first is a focus on structural inequalities and the social determinants of health, with strong critiques of global neoliberalism and an intersectional lens that addresses intersectional or interlocking systems of oppression, while also affirming the urgency of ecological sustainability. The second one is an emphasis on the impacts of multiple crises and their toll on mental health, while also highlighting that collective and care practices act as protective and regenerative forces. The third one is a vision for innovative, care-based public health frameworks, especially at the local level, grounded in community well-being rather than market efficiency. The fourth is a commitment to co-produce knowledge and policies, participatory feminist research that is bottom-up, rooted in lived experience, and socially accountable. Finally, continuous engagement with communities, social movements, and public policy, including a critical awareness of corporate accountability. This involves forging alliances between community actors, progressive institutions, and researchers to generate lasting and systemic change. Let us now listen to these two voices who will help us to understand the world and inspire us to reimagine it and remake it. Let's introduce now Professor Joan Benach, who is a full professor in the Department of Political and Social Science of this university, Pompeu Fabra. He directs the Health Inequalities Research Group, Employment Conditions Network, and co-directs the Johns Hopkins UPF Public Policy Center. With a background in medicine and public health, Professor Benach holds an MD, an MPH, and a PhD in public health from Johns Hopkins University. His interdisciplinary training also includes studies in history and social science methodologies. In 2022, he coordinated the PRESME report for Spain's Ministry of Labor and Social Economy, examining the effects of job insecurity on mental health. His findings have informed policy discussions highlighting the significant role of social and economic factors in mental health outcomes. He's the director of the scientific committee of this great European conference on eco-social determinants of health inequity. The floor is yours, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Enjoy the conference, enjoy Barcelona. As co-director of the Johns Hopkins UPF Public Policy Center and the entire team who has organized this conference, also the European Union Commission, the organizations that supported us, I warmly welcome all of you here, to those also following online and those who will watch the event later. I also want to express again the welcome on behalf of Keisha Pollack-Porter, the co-director of the center, who unfortunately, as mentioned, could not be with us today. Keisha, thanks for being here and extends really a warm welcome. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Transdisciplinary Perspectives on the Eco-Social Determinants of Health Inequities. I have a number of acknowledgements to make, all the members of the Public Policy Center, Gretz Emconet, and specifically the persons that you can see on the screen at this moment. This is the outline of my presentation. I want to talk a bit first on health inequities as a systemic and pervasive issue. I want to use the case of food systems to learn several important lessons, and then I'll provide a quick view of the importance of using critical thinking for understanding eco-social complexity, something which is dramatically needed, I'm afraid, in institutions and universities. And I'll end with some reflections on transdisciplinarity. So let's start with health inequities as a systemic and pervasive issue. So here we can observe the evolution of global inequality according to the World Inequality Lab, probably the research group with the best data, with measures that share corresponding to the bottom 50%, middle 40%, and top 10% between 1820 and 2020. Today, global inequalities are as extreme as they were at the peak of Western imperialism in the early 20th century. Another recent report on global inequality, the latest report from Oxfam published a few months ago, tell us these 5 points. For example, 3.6 billion people, 44%, are under the poverty line, understanding by that $7. The richest 1% own 45% of all wealth. Between 1765 and 1900, $34 trillion was drained from India to the richest 10% in the UK. 60% of billionaire wealth is inherited or gained from corruption or monopoly power. In 2023, the Global South paid over $30 million an hour to the richest 1% in the Global North. So why this is happening? How to change this? So we need to understand the roots of global economic inequality. Again, researchers from the World Inequality Lab, led by the French economist Thomas Piketty, say that political and institutional factors and the ideological strife between competing state powers and social classes have played major roles in past shifts, and that this is also likely to be so in the future. And they also add that unless they are forced to, through revolution, and they use this word, land reform or permanent systems of progressive taxation and redistribution of wealth, the richest economic groups are unlikely to give away their assets. So how this inequality in wealth is reflected in health? You see here life expectancy at birth in the world. There are over 30 years difference, not just 5, not just 7, which would be dramatic, but just 30 years difference between countries. And we know that mortality reflects the way in which we live, we work, and relate each other. Globally, health inequity causes an estimated 16 million excess deaths yearly, 25% of all deaths, and 800 million life years lost, with the heaviest burden in India and the sub-Saharan Africa. Women and children are especially affected in low-income countries. In the US, life expectancy has declined, reflecting a deep ethical and social crisis. Life expectancy has stagnated and inequalities are large. In the UK, some areas also saw a decline in life expectancy. Between 2011 and 2019, over 1 million people died earlier than they would have if they had lived in areas with the same age and sex-specific death rates as those in the least deprived areas. And there are many other striking examples. One of them is the case is Glasgow in Scotland, where the Commission on Social Determinants of Health years ago found out that there was a 28-year difference between the richest and the poorest neighborhoods, saying that within Glasgow, there are neighborhoods similar to low-income countries. In Glasgow, in the context of the government neoliberal policies, around 20% of Glasgow's population was income deprived in 2020. Mortality inequalities are worsening and contributing to widen. And inequities are very pervasive and interrelated. If we take, for example, the updated edition of the Spirit Level, published last year by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett and other collaborators, we can see that this inequality is significantly and strongly associated with a country's level of health, social, and environmental problems. Although today the productive capacities of the world are enormous in terms of resources, in terms of technology, in terms of factories, energy, materials, etc., Paradoxically, the majority of the population lives in conditions of massive deprivation with a high percentage of people unable to meet their basic needs. Two reflections on health inequities, one from Vandana Shiva, quite famous physicist and ecofeminist and ecologist. Health inequities provide one of the best available sources of evidence for describing and explaining how well-being and justice are unequally distributed globally. That's why everyone should take care or should care about inequities and health inequities, everyone. And for the French doctor and anthropologist, Didier Fazen, inequalities in life are simply the price to be paid for the structural inequalities in society. We must talk about life policies, about the way in which societies treat humans and non-human lives. Okay, now I'm going to move to use the case of the food systems to exemplify many points we can learn about health inequities, its causes, and the potential solutions. In an era dominated by big data, automation, AI, and other emerging technologies, hunger remains a pressing issue. Yet, paradoxically, we now face a dual challenge: undernourishment and obesity that, as we see, stem from the same underlying social factors. 2,400 million people experience food insecurity, while 735 million suffer from hunger, but 890 million are obese and 2,500 million people are overweight. You see here the prevalence of undernourishment and number of people undernourished from 2005 2023. Global hunger rose sharply from 2019 to 2021 and persisted at the same level to 2023. 1 out of 11 people in the world suffer hunger, the majority in Africa, and 2,800 million cannot afford a healthy diet, 1/3 globally, and 72% in low-income countries. If we combine the prevalence of thinness and obesity by country for children and adolescents, we realize that overweight and obesity kills more people today than underweight. The combined burden of underweight and obesity has increased in most countries, driven by an increase in obesity, while underweight and thinness remain prevalent, especially in South Asia and parts of Africa. So there is a global epidemic of obesity, and it's getting worse. Between 1900 and 2021, the combined prevalence of overweight and obesity in children and adolescents doubled, and that of obesity alone tripled. And in terms of inequality, there is a shift in the burden of overweight and obesity to the poor. As country income increases, the burden of overweight and obesity shifts from the wealthy to the poor. With this picture in mind, we can ask ourselves why. What are the causes of a disaster that has been generated in just a few decades? The mainstream scientific causes of obesity put the attention on genetic disorders, psychobiological factors, and individual behavior. And that's where the majority of research and funds go. Here you see a picture of causes of overweight and obesity included in a mainstream report that expands a bit the psychobiomedical view I just mentioned. We find here social determinants of health, as urbanization, built environment, trade liberalization, for example. Yet, what issues are missing or hidden, or are at least not explicitly mentioned with enough detail and clarity? What are the elephants in the room? One of them is the rise of ultra-processed foods, products made with low-cost ingredients and processes to maximize profit. So here you can see per capita ultra-processed foods sales in kilograms by region 2006-2019, with projections for 2024, in which basically all regions show a strong ultra-processed food sales growth. At the same time, another elephant in the room is the fact that over the past decades, we have been facing the rising prevalence not only on obesity and overweight, but also metabolic diseases, diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, hypertension, and hyperlipidemia. That means a large burden to global health. All these issues are connected in a syndemic way. Basically, a bunch of few corporations control almost everything we consume. When you go to the supermarket with different brands, basically all belong to few large corporations. If we take the case of the baby food industry, market share, and the global influence network of leading corporations such as Nestlé, Danone, and others in the world, we see this picture. A large concentration of power. With the networks, they control the rise of big formulas. Material power is reflected in high levels of market concentration nearly everywhere. The 6 largest milk formula manufacturers have almost 2/3 of the world sales. The 3 largest, a market share of 42%. And also, we know some of the practices of these corporations. Let's illustrate this point with a very known example to learn something about the need of applying a transdisciplinary approach. Nestlé is the largest global food manufacturer and global market leader for infant milk products, with a market share of close to 1/4. Companies manipulate consumers' emotional responses to sell a variety of products, but the case of Nestlé is especially unethical when it comes to the health of vulnerable babies. Nestlé is the world's largest food manufacturer, generating $103 billion in annual revenue. The formula milk is a US $55,000 million per year industry. Nestlé advertised, and this is a very well-known historical issue in public health, Nestlé advertised their formula as superior to breast milk in low-income countries. The tactics employed in promotional campaigns include the use of mass media, such as newspapers, radio, TV, the flow of health services with advertising and promotional material and free samples, and the use of what was called the milk nurses, nurses hired by milk companies to support infant care and hygiene, but whose real role was to promote their company's products, often in competition with our company's milk nurses. In March 1974, the British NGO War on Want published the booklet called The Baby Killers. And then another Swiss group called the Third World Working Group translated the booklet into German to directly accuse the company. Children die not only because infant formula is less nutritious than breast milk, but also because the water used to prepare was contaminated, and the bottles of feeding equipment are not properly sterilized. In such conditions, babies are at high risk of diarrhea, diseases, malnutrition, and infections. The availability of formula in low and middle income countries resulted in approximately 60,000 infant deaths only in 1981, and likely hundreds of thousands or millions perhaps in the last decades in countries such as Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, Philippines, India, Brazil, and Mexico. Between 1977, 1988, 1984, there was an international boycott against Nestlé. In 1981, the International Code of Marketing of breast milk substitutes was adopted. However, many reports have still shown multiple violations of the code. And big businesses in low-income countries, in many respects, continue doing some harmful practices. Another important elephant to be aware is a tactic closely related to politics. Very important if we want to have a transdisciplinary mind. When Nestlé harmful practices became clear, a coalition of health professionals, church groups, and activists launched boycotts. In response, Nestlé first used standard PR, public relations. But seeing little improvement, Vice President Ernest Saunders called for an urgent counter-propaganda strategy. They hire Rafael Pagan and other people. Rafael Pagan was a former Army intelligence office and advisor of the US presidents, many US presidents, who worked for Nestle from 1981 to 1985, and later for Shell and other companies. Pagan analyzed the boycott movements and categorized the activists into 4 key groups. The radicals, the most important ones. And he said, we need to isolate them. The idealists, we need to pursue them. The realists, we need to co-opt and negotiate with them. And the opportunists, we have to bot off them. And this tactic and this division has been used quite often for quite a long time since then. You see here the ultra-processed food industry, global corporate influence network of corporations, organizations, and interest groups. The ultra-processed food industry has built a powerful global corporate influence network that shapes global food governance. But what do? They create addictions to food products. Today in the US, more than 2/3 of the food supply consists of this type of product. As explained by Michael Moss, a journalist, another component of transdisciplinary approach. Michael Moss, a journalist specialized in the analysis of the food system industry. According to Michael Moss, salt, sugar, fat are the 3 pillars, the holy grail on which the food industry survives and sell better their products. So let's listen. Short clip of Michael Moss.
Yeah, the food companies are incredibly good at sort of tapping into those biological instincts we have for cheapness. We love our food as inexpensive as we can possibly get it. We love our food to be convenient and easy as a time saver. And then, of course, we love the flavors that they're able to emit. And they're really brilliant at tapping into and exploiting those biological loves that we have. I mean, I was lucky to meet one of the icons in the industry. His name was Howard Moskowitz. He was trained in high math and then experimental psychology at Harvard University. He's responsible for many of the biggest sort of brand products in the grocery store. And he walked me through his recent creation of a new flavor of soda for the American company, Dr. Pepper. Right. Where he started with no less than 60 versions of sweetness, submitted those to 3,000 or 4,000 consumer taste testings around the country, and then took the data and put it in his computer, and he did his high math regression analysis thing, and out comes these bell-shaped curves where at the top of the curve is the perfect amount of sweetness that would send the most people over the moon and their products flying off the shelf. It was Howard who coined the term the bliss point to describe our innate biological attraction to sugar.
And how they do it? Well, which tactics? Well, marketing, advertising, lobbying, public relations, litigation, when necessary, sponsoring research, campaigns, contributions to parties and governments, and even illegal strategies to advance toward their objectives. So taking all the elements I described, we must put attention to the biggest elephant in the room, which is the global agro-industrial complex food system at different levels, with supermarkets, prepared food, flavors, which is big business, processing foods, chemicals, many others. Of course, all this is not the center, although this is not the center of my talk, but globally there is a lot of resistance against these forces. And the battle and the final result of what may happen remains, of course, open. See just a few examples of the struggle for food sovereignty and the global food systems, which are more democratic, just, sustainable, and healthy for all, Via Campesina, the landless movement in Brazil, or many others around the globe. At the same time, using our transdisciplinary critical mind, we need to put attention to another side of the coin of this crisis, the $1 trillion profit-driven diet-related industry, based on on weight loss, drugs, diet management, diet apps, programs, health food alternatives, bariatric surgery, clinical services, fitness, and diet supplements. But the final conclusion is that there is a dangerous, accelerating spiral that harms people and destroys the planet. The capitalist agro-industrial complex food system generates obesogenic environments that trigger a multi-scale syndemic of health inequities, while it profits from commodifying psychomedical solutions, perpetuating a self-reinforcing cycle where crises are created and monetized, entrenching systemic exploitation of the people and the planet. So let's keep these lessons in mind that help to understand the eco-social determinants of health inequities and the food system crisis. It can be argued, taking into account these lessons, that there is a need to apply critical thinking, an issue closely related to transdisciplinarity. So here is a short summary of what is critical thinking. It's much easier to say, much more difficult to apply, of course, but commitment to evidence and truth, questioning conventional wisdom, incorporating systems thinking, understanding historical context, recognizing processes and mechanisms of power, integrating scientific disciplines, but also popular knowledge, including Michael Moss, as we listen, journalists, who makes good research, engagement to pursue justice and resist oppression. We might also add other features like the need to have a creative selection of data, information, knowledge, and maybe others. Perhaps the opposite to critical thinking is the science of agnotology. What is agnotology? The study of making ignorance, the politics of ignorance. One well-known example of agnotology dates back to December 14, 1953, when the big tobacco companies, the big companies that run the business, were met in the Hotel Plaza in New York and fabricated the strategy of manufacturing doubt. Doubt is our product, a tactic later on applied by the oil industry to face climate change. However, things are even much worse than just creating ignorance or fake news. It's not only a matter of more or less knowledge, it's ideology. It's our view of the world, the mental glasses through which we see and understand and feel the world. Take, for example, the words of Noam Chomsky when he says, the less capable the state is of using violence to defend the interests of the dominant elite groups, the more necessary it becomes to develop techniques for manufacturing consent. Or take, for example, the words of Paulo Freire, the famous Brazilian pedagogue, when he states that the dominant ideology not only masks the reality, but it makes us myopic to not clearly see this reality. I want to illustrate these points by using a short clip of the movie Detachment, where a teacher of a poor neighborhood tries to re-educate the students with some ideas. So watch and listen.
What does that mean?
To take something in.
Okay, excellent. To absorb. Anyone?
Everywhere, all the time.
So what is ubiquitous assimilation?
Always absorbing everything everywhere all the time.
Well done, George. How are you to imagine anything if the images are always provided for you? Who here read 1984 last year? Good.
Having two opposing beliefs at once and believing that both are true.
Excellent, Nirna. Deliberately believe in lies while knowing they're false. This is a marketing holocaust. 24 hours a day, For the rest of our lives, the powers that be are hard at work, dumbing us to death. So, to defend ourselves and fight against assimilating this dullness into our thought processes, we must learn to read, to stimulate our own imaginations, to cultivate our own consciousness, our own belief systems. We all need these skills to defend, to preserve our own minds.
So critical thinking is very closely connected with transdisciplinarity. So let me start talking a bit of transdisciplinarity by using two quotations from great thinkers, a philosopher and a sociologist. Mario Bunge says, things are far too complex to be handled by a single discipline. After all, the total sum of human knowledge is not a mere aggregation, but a system, and the systemic nature of knowledge mirrors the systematic character of the world. And take Immanuel Wallerstein, when he says, we have studied phenomena such as globalization, terrorism, etc., in separate boxes, to which we have given special names: politics, economics, the social structure, culture, without seeing that these boxes are construct more of our imagination than of reality. The separate boxes of analysis or disciplines are an obstacle, not an aid to understanding the world. So here you can see several definitions of different approaches towards using several disciplines. Multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. Multidisciplinarity brings together multiple disciplinary perspectives on a shared problem, but each perspective remains separate with little or no integration across fields. Interdisciplinarity fosters genuine integration, theories, not just methods and data and analysis, but theories, methods, data and interpretation of results from different disciplines through collaborative teamwork that produces a unified framework or solution. Transdisciplinarity goes beyond interdisciplinarity collaboration by also actively involving non-academic stakeholders, especially when they sometimes is very necessary. Community members, policymakers, industry, to co-create knowledge and solutions that span both scientific and practical realms. Now, there are many great transdisciplinary thinkers and researchers. We could talk about Lynn Margulis, Elinor Ostrom, Donella Meadows, Vandana Shiva, Gabor Mate, Mike Davis, Richard Lewins. Let's listen to the voice of an important physicist, Murray Gell-Mann.
I've spoken many times about how a great deal of research and teaching in the sciences and the humanities, especially at universities, is confined to individual departments representing particular fields of knowledge. And while specialization, subspecialization, and so on are inevitable and necessary, they need to be supplemented by research and teaching that transcend those sometimes narrow disciplinary boundaries. Can we think about the attempts to alleviate extreme poverty without considering the unwise, environmentally destructive projects that are sometimes carried out in the name of that worthy cause? Can we discuss issues of global governance without considering politics in the various countries and regions, and without treating the competition and conflict among different ideologies? If military and diplomatic policies fail and mankind is plunged into a hugely destructive war, which is not at all impossible, perhaps even one involving thermonuclear weapons, can our other objectives be attained? Are we really going to worry about saving wolves after a thermonuclear war? And so on. We have to get rid of the idea that careful study of a problem in some narrow range of issues is the only kind of work to be taken seriously, while integrated thinking is relegated to cocktail party conversation.
So things are much more richly connected than what we sometimes imagine, even crossing disciplines. In the field of analyzing ecosystems and health, in the last decades, there have appeared interesting initiatives such as the Exposome, the One Health approach, and the planetary health. For the sake of saving time, I'm just going to very briefly refer to planetary health, a concept launched by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Lancet Commission in 2015, and more recently in a new report last year, in which planetary health focuses on the interdependence of human health and the Earth's natural systems. The mainstream idea is that planetary health is a solutions-oriented, transdisciplinary field and social movement focused on analyzing and addressing the impacts of human disruption to Earth's natural systems on human health and all life on Earth. Yet, I think that from the transdisciplinary critical perspective, I'm proposing here what are the main criticisms to be made to this approach that is, no question about it, very valuable. 4 main points. The epistemic arrogance, so framing problems as technical knowledge gaps, ignoring underlying political structures for the most part, the neocolonial bias, marginalizing for the most part indigenous and global South knowledge systems, technocratic neutrality, that depoliticizing health and environmental issues, avoiding structural causes, and top-down activism, promoting a social movement from above, lacking for the most part, again, grassroots participation and democratic legitimacy. Indeed, we need a new approach to planetary health, one that connects Earth systems with social and political systems. A weak, limited, transdisciplinary view is useless for real policy and change. So we must address geopolitics, power, capitalism, neoliberalism, neo-fascism, imperialism, war, rights, neocolonialism, exploitation, oppression, classism, sexism, racism, and other forms of discrimination, issues largely missing from current discussions on planetary and even public health. So we can hear some reflections from the great Canadian journalist Naomi Klein when a decade ago she presented her book on capitalism and climate change.
When we marvel at that blue marble in all of its delicacy and frailty and resolve to save the planet, we cast ourselves in a very specific role. That role is of a parent, the parent of the earth. But the opposite is the case, as every traditional society that sees the earth as a mother knows. It is we humans who are fragile and vulnerable, and the earth that is hardy and powerful and hold us in its hands. One person who saw it coming was Kurt Vonnegut, who saw a lot coming. He wrote in 1969, "Earth is such a pretty blue and pink and white pearl in the pictures NASA sent to me. It looks so clean. You can't see all the hungry, angry earthlings down there, and the smoke and the sewage and the trash and the sophisticated weaponry. In other words, seen from space, there are no people down there." It's worth remembering this point. In December 2012, a complex systems scientist walked up to the podium at the American Geophysics Union to present a paper. It was titled, "Is Earth Fucked?" His answer was, "Yeah, pretty much. That's where the road we're on is taking us. But that has less to do with carbon than it does with capitalism. Our economic model is at war with life on Earth. We can't change the laws of nature, but we can change our broken economy. That's why climate change isn't just a disaster. It's also our best chance to demand and build a better world."
What kind of transdisciplinary knowledge approach we need? I believe that we need a critical approach that at least includes the following 6 issues. It needs to be critical and complex. It needs to challenge hegemonic disciplines, like, for example, conventional economics, and critically integrate social disciplines with natural and physical sciences. It needs to be systemic and interconnected, expanding the frameworks to address interconnected ecosocial and health crises. It needs to address structural and multiscalar issues, analyzing interactions at multiple levels from different perspectives, macro-level systems interacting with national, regional, and local realities, and vice versa. It needs to be historical and social, enriching our understanding of the complexity of events, the power relations, the cultural norms. It needs to be participatory and engaged, fostering the popular participation in science and commitment to collective decision-making and the involvement of grassroots communities. And it needs to be timely and practical, developing viable answers tailored to each historical moment and necessity. Are we going to fix all the world problems with a transdisciplinary critical perspective? Certainly not, but it might help a lot. So let me finish my talk with the voice of 3 great researchers and also activists at some extent. One is Donella Meadows, when she says, "The system leads us to live in an unsustainable manner. Today, we don't have systems that are truly sustainable. Do we have time? I don't know. Nobody knows. Where do we start? By asking questions, something that we should try to do all the time, especially with the students." The second text is from Nicholas Georgescu-Reagan, when he states that we are plagued by an energy crisis, but the greater crisis is the crisis of our wisdom. Our destiny depends far more on our wisdom than on our knowledge. And finally, a last thought from Richard Lewins, when he said, "Taking the systems apart to treat problems one at a time can produce disasters. Problems have to be solved in their rich complexity. The present crisis is a general crisis of our species and also a specific crisis of the capitalist systems." Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Joan Benach, for this engaging and meaningful presentation. Let me now please briefly introduce Professor Wendy Harcourt. She holds a PhD in history from the Australian National University and a BA with first-class honors from the University of Adelaide. She's a professor of gender, diversity, and sustainable development at the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University Rotterdam in The Hague. She joined this institute in November 2011 after 23 years as editor and director of programs at the Society for International Development in Rome, Italy. She has an extensive publication record, including over 100 articles and several influential books. Her monograph, Body Politics in Development, Critical Debates in Gender Development, 2009, received the 2010 Feminist Women's Studies Association Book Prize. And her recent open access edited volumes, Feminist Methodologies, Experiments, Collaborations, and Reflections, 2022, and Contour of Feminist Political Ecology, 2023, a great book, reflect her ongoing commitment to collaborative and transformative scholarship. Please, Professor Harcourt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I was tempted to start by saying, and now for something completely different. Of course, it's not. There are many resonances with what you've just heard. But what's different is I'm not going to present a PowerPoint. So I'm going to ask you to listen carefully to me, especially if my voice works. And I hope you'll see the convergences and resonances with what we're both saying. I was hoping there was going to be a PowerPoint slide up. Yes, thank you. at least so you know what I'm meant to be talking about as I talk about it. And I'll explain a little bit about that image in a minute. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to rethink and therefore to unsettle and disrupt our discourses around eco-social determinants of health. And I'm taking up that challenge by beginning my intervention with a poem. I am the beneficiary of whiteness, Western education, colonial plunder, resource extraction. Deep in my fabric is longing for change, even if my immediate visceral self does not know the sharp edge of life. My research and writings, like my body, are soft and pliable, shaped by the fortune of being born in a certain place and time. I feel the unease of such a life, with its remote connections to other worlds, marked by different realities. We are caught in the drive to accumulate, to be measured and assessed, where success is written into our biology and economic wealth. How long we live, the money we make, the things we buy. But Homo economicus is not the only story. That which we have made, we can unmake and with intention, remake. How to create worlds that are vast, relaxed, generous, and safe. Worlds where we have equality, hope, freedom, and justice, rather than greed, despair, destruction, and fear. Now is the moment to remake the current dominant scientific, cosmological, religious vision of humanity as quintessentially biological economic beings. We do not need to struggle against scarcity, trying to avert death by expropriating nature's forces through industrialization, exploiting humans and more than human others. We can take responsibility for the consequences of Homo economicus. We can remake the death world. Let's start by telling plural, otherwise stories. I speak to you today as a white settler Australian, cis woman living in Europe. I'm a feminist political ecologist, currently an academic, transitioning back to being a feminist advocate and writer. I'm still hopeful that the new will emerge, and the conversations we will have here are part of that emergence. So, what does being a feminist mean for thinking about eco-social transitions which determine health and well-being? Yes, feminism is about changing gender relations, challenging heteronormativity. It is linked to issues of race, class, sexual difference, age, bodily diversity. It has diverse histories and encounters in different parts of the world, as well as being a transnational movement that engages in a huge range of issues, of which fairness, equity, health, ecological and economic transitions are among them. But today, I am using feminism as a way to understanding how knowledge and politics operates, which for me is fundamental if we are to understand eco-social transitions that are needed for health, care, and well-being. I use feminist writing and practice to, 1, employ the art of noticing, looking at what surprises, pay attention to the small things, the everyday emotions, the concerns that worries our lives. 2, stay with the trouble, looking at what does not fit, what is challenging and difficult, what is contradictory or made invisible in mainstream narratives and stories. 3, analyze power from an intersectional perspective, seeking to understand complex relations in intimate personal engagements, as well as economic hegemonic systems, paying attention to how gender, race, class, embodied, generational, and more than human relations and other differences relate and shape our life worlds. 4, produce knowledge that is collective and hopeful, undertaking research and actions which are not extractive, are respectful of difference, inclusive, politically open, and contribute to positive change. When I was invited to speak at this conference, I admit I was not entirely sure what I should share. So I proposed to speak about feminist ecological social transitions for health, care, and well-being. Well, my proposed title was not exactly adopted, but I'm still going to expound on that theme. I'm basing it from my latest book called Conundrums of Care, Key Feminist Debates for Critical Development Studies, this is the cover of the book, which was actually done by my daughter, Emma Claire Sardoni, so a bit of motherly pride there too. And it's the first in a new series of books I'm now editing with Bloomsbury Academic, and it's open access and out early 2026. Apologies for the small marketing. First time. Okay, so my talk stays with the trouble to consider first feminist responses to the COVID pandemic, and second, feminist understandings of interspecies entanglements. I suggest what feminist insights can provide for the conference discussions on eco-social transitions for health care and well-being. I refer to the work of feminist scholars and activists to explain why we need to consider issues of care and interspecies entanglements as we look at the ways individual, interpersonal, community, organizational, and policy factors influence inequalities in health outcomes and behaviors. The pandemic situation underlined how much it mattered, which states governed your lives, which resources you could access, including basic food, water, shelter, and healthcare. The pandemic revealed the complexity of care work, made visible the care deficits, and reinforced a collective responsibility for care, and the need to expand circles of solidarity and the lines separating us from them. The breakdown of families, the loneliness of older people, and the deterioration of mental health, even in richer countries, revealed the importance of care as emotional and effective labor. As US-based feminists Michael Vine and Joan Tronto in 2022 noted, the pressure cooker of the COVID pandemic opened up discussions on all aspects of care, as many existing models, practices, and assumptions proved inappropriate, and the political dimensions of care became starkly apparent. Whether COVID-19 opened a portal of possibility or not, as Arundhati Roy famously asserted, it did kindle feminist hope that care work would be revalued, given the visible increase in women's care responsibilities due to the pandemic and the failure of states to respond. The pandemic exposed the essentiality of care, the structural and pre-existing crisis of care, and included the planetary care, need for planetary care, according to Austrian feminist architect Elke Krasny. Feminist sociologist Shereen Rai, in her 2024 book, also looked at how the growing costs of care and the caring for our social and ecological worlds is leading to depletion, and calls for strategies for recognizing, measuring, pluralizing, and reversing the harms of depletion in the context of the growing costs of care and caring for our social and ecological worlds. The COVID crisis revealed the gender and racialized experience of care, the labor and exploitation in the global South. It also revealed the importance of building solidarities amongst different locations, while at the same time challenging historical global North-centric universalisms. During COVID, when care work became visible and labeled as vital work, many innovative feminist recovery plans emerged that pushed for systemic change. These manifestos presented strong feminist imaginaries of how to care differently at a systemic level. For example, the Hawaii Feminist Recovery Plan in 2022 addressed the crises in healthcare, social, ecological, and economic policies. The plan speaks not only about response and recovery, but also of repair and revival. Repair of the historic harms and international trauma playing out as male domination, gender-based violence, economic insecurity, poor health, and mass incarceration. It set out how to revive place-based practices of knowledge and self-determination that enables our connections, inseparably economic and social, with women and one another, and with the wider world in order to build bridges for a feminist future. It underlines the need for deep cultural change, which focuses on relations of care to reverse climate change, repair historical violence and inequality within and between countries, address inequalities within households, and value all members of communities beyond their value to economic production and capitalism. Another manifesto, the Care Manifesto, The Politics of Interdependence, written jointly by the UK-based Care Collective, argued for a politics that puts care front and centre. They define care as nurturing welfare and flourishing. Care is our individual and common ability to provide the political, social, material, and emotional conditions that allow the vast majority of people and living creatures on this planet to thrive, along with the planet itself. The Feminist Recovery Plan project of the University of Warwick also envisaged the COVID crisis as an opportunity to reimagine the policies with a focus on grassroots activism. Activism is understood here as an important form of social reproduction work, invisible and unvalued, but necessary to bring about social change. Such manifestos and plans are examples of feminist visions of ways to build on caring relations that was made visible as vital work during COVID. But you may well ask, did these feminist plans and manifestos lead to change? Well, it's not yet evident that there is a new global care order in the making, but I would argue that the manifestos offer important ways to think about care work and are part of our collective resilience and ability to find ways to live sustainably where health, care, well-being are central. We should not lose sight of what they propose, particularly given that the disruptions caused by the pandemic, wars, political instability, and climate change are set to continue. Paying attention to care means we need to slow down and adjust to complex, messy, and not always predictable ways of living. Our current world is dominated by speed, innovation, and assumes there is progress that can be measured. There seems to be no time to care. Care is antithetical to dominant images of modern economic living. Centering the care work of the marginalized and oppressed, the unseen and unmentioned, is profoundly radical. It draws attention to why we need to challenge dominant imageries of boundless horizons of economic growth that are built on lack of care of others, indeed on carelessness. Toronto calls this dominant form of care wealth care, caring for wealth, not people. She points out how wealth care shapes our political economy so that we principally care for wealth and celebrate the obscenely wealthy 1% in such a way that profit and economic growth are the central activities and purpose of society. Such wealth care leads to both the extremes of wealth and poverty, as well as to the exploitation of nature. Indeed, COVID also made us aware of our multi-species interconnectedness and the interdependency in the face of humanity's carelessness and the ruination of the planet. Feminist writing about ethics of care invites us to think differently, not only about humanity's reciprocal relations of care with each other, but also about interspecies care, subverting dominant hierarchies which place humans above other species. Feminists propose ways to navigate the ethics of caring for the more than human other in eco-social transitions for healthcare and well-being. Feminist investigations into interspecies entanglements look at humans as one among other forms of life, caught up in diverse relationships of knowing and living together with other living beings. Their writing pushes us beyond anthropocentrism as they point to the lively ways the boundaries between humans and other life forms are porous and intertwined. Black feminist ecologist Alex Powling-Gum stated in her book Undrowned, "If we learn to identify with the more than human others, humans will not be so tangled in the separation and domination that is constantly making our lives incompatible with the planet." Feminist science and technology studies scholar Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, in Matters of Care, also offers an expansive feminist text on care for thinking and living in more than human worlds. Her work investigates the meanings of care for knowing and thinking with more than human worlds in technoscience and nature cultures. She analyzes ecological practices that are remattering soil from inert, usable substance and resource into a living world of which humans are also a part. She argues that if we are to survive the climate catastrophe, we need to disrupt productivist, future-oriented technoscience by making time to take care of our ecological relations with soil. Such global care should not be driven by dominant productivist visions that treat soil not only as a vehicle for commodifiable produce, where worn-out soils must be put back to work through soil engineering technologies to increase soil's efficiency. These feminists show how our health and well-being are entangled with the environment, even if we imagine our bodies as separate from and unaffected by our environments. US biology Nancy Langston, writing about the rural US, stated, "We're all in this together. The atrazine that gets sprayed on my neighbor's cornfields ends up in the river water, then in the fish, then in the herons and the raccoons that eat the fish, and it also ends up in my breasts, my belly, and my blood. What's out there in wildlife and wild places is also in our bodies. A feminist politics of care and ethical relations encourages us to take responsibility for our interspecies entanglements in life and after death. Feminist hope and curiosity can make visible the messy, embodied interspecies entanglements of humans and show what we are losing by failing to embrace an ethics of care for the more than human others. To quote the influential science and technology studies feminist Donna Haraway, to care is wet, emotional, messy, and demanding of the best thinking one has ever done. All humans and more than human others are vulnerable, and all are recipients and givers of care. Understanding care requires us to address systemic layers of oppression that have expropriated bodies and social reproduction, racializes and expropriated peoples and earth others' bodies and labors through colonial, indigenous, and ecological disposition that fundamentally determines the eco-social determinants of health and well-being in our life worlds. The invitation of the feminist political project is that care needs to play a central role if we are to understand the social and environmental factors that shape and reproduce social inequities, impacting the health of individuals and communities. Indigenous feminists, so Todd states, reciprocity, love, accountability, and care are tools we will require to face uncertain futures and the ends of worlds as we know them. Indeed, this ability to face the past, present, and future with care, tending to relations between people, place, and stories, will be crucial as we face the challenges of these times. So to conclude, the conference has taken social justice, planetary health, and health equity as central to humanity's survival and well-being. I add to that the importance of care as at the core of our human and more than human political project of transition. Learning from feminist collectives and writing, I see care as the life-making and life-sustaining activities that maintain our life worlds. Care is crucial to understanding the eco-social determinants for health from an embodied social, political, and ecological point of view, which determines how humans and more than humans are entangled together in interspecies communities which make up our planet. Feminist contributions to understanding care and well-being need to be part of these transformative approaches to health, ecology, sustainability, and social justice. Feminist imaginaries help us to understand our shared responsibility of the present and future health of all living beings on this planet. By paying attention to care as a fundamental practice for life, we can move towards the possibilities that fair and equitable health practices can nourish a deep well-being for humans and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harcourt, for such an enlightening and moving presentation. As Professor Benach was saying at the very end of his presentation, quoting Meadows, let's ask questions. And I'm sure that you have many for our panelists, and we welcome now your reflections and questions, comments. You are all invited to join the conversation. We have around 20 minutes if the organization, yeah. So maybe you have questions for each other or, perfect. Do you want to ask? Yeah, please.
Actually,
go ahead.
I was so aware when I was giving my presentation that I could see the similarities and also the differences in our two presentations. Apart from the fact that I read, and I was also trying to speak from a kind of notion of imaginary and also from a poem, which is, by the way, the first time I've ever done that in this sort of setting. I did that deliberately because I wanted to show that different forms of knowledges, I don't think it's wisdom, but different forms of knowledges are important if we are to do this transdisciplinary conversation. So I did want to ask, because I was also incredibly impressed by everything that was presented. And I wanted to see from you, how did you see a resonance, or did you feel that this was something other that couldn't really link to all the facts, the political insights, the philosophical ways of thinking from so many different voices that you were talking about. I also had many different voices, although I didn't have pictures of them. But these were feminist voices saying quite different things. So I'd be really interested to hear if I think this is what happens with feminists. We kind of read all of these things and then try to think, what's our approach and how do we engage? So I want to ask you, how would you engage with what I had to say? How's that?
Well, I'm not sure how to engage. I should think a lot about it, but maybe a few thoughts about the type of knowledge we need and the type of action we need. Certainly, we need a lot of specialists to understand many things in the world, any kind of thing. You can name it, biology, discrimination, oppression, whatever. We need specialists, sociologists, we need psychologists, all kinds of disciplines together. So that's one thing. Nothing to say against specialism from my side. At the same time, as I try to convey a little bit in my presentation, I think that to put together knowledge that coming from disciplines, scientific disciplines, because science has a lot of value in many ways, right? So we learn a lot, especially when we think about basic science, technologies, whatever. I think that we need to go back to some old ideas when specialists knew a lot about other issues, right? So one can be a specialist, but if you don't understand almost anything, and that's what's happening today in institutions, research centers, universities, you know nothing about what's going on with other disciplines. And remember, disciplines are something very artificial that was created in 19th century for the most part and developed and developed and grew and grow and grow since then. So that's one aspect. Be a specialist, find, put together other kinds of knowledge from other disciplines and retain some of the main elements. It's not so complicated. I mean, one can be a biologist and understand the very basics of social determinants or eco-social determinants of health. It's not so complicated. To have the clear idea so that there is a discussion, there is a conversation. At the same time, we need other types of knowledge, right? That comes from our experience, our action, our collective action as well. I put the example, for example, in my presentation of journalists. I value a lot research journalists. I mean, how can we understand what's going on, for example, inside the corporations, unless there are people like Michael Moss and some others, for example, the woman who studied very closely corporations, chemical corporations like Monsanto, right? Unless we have this kind of knowledge. So we need also this kind of knowledge. We need to have an integrative mind. We need to put together many kinds of things and disciplines, including, of course, the experience of daily lives. Many of them, especially in the case of women, that are invisible or are not very clearly visible, at least, right? So that's one thing. With that, I don't think we are going to change the world, but at least we are going to understand much better the world and the causes of what's going on. I put the example as well of the planetary health or planetary well-being, which is, again, very, very important. I think a term, biologists, physicists, many experts working together to understand the diagnosis of what's going on in the world right now, which is very worrisome. I mean, report after report after report, we say, okay, maybe, I mean, we already see these problems in many parts of the world in low-income countries, but in few years, decades, this is going to spread around the globe, inevitably, just starting with climate change and the rise of the level of the sea, right? So definitely we need to do many things. Knowledge and wisdom, I also mentioned that. I think it's crucial. But with that, we need to put also ideological perspectives of the world, how we understand the world in ideological terms, in ethical terms. And with that needs to go action and policy and social movements and organization. That's the only way that the world improved substantially in many cases during the 20th century, right? Anyway, I don't answer your question, but at least some reflection.
Would you like to comment on that?
Oh, I agree, and but it didn't answer my question because I was interested in if you heard, or maybe it also could be, it was not so clear, that these are a set of feminist ways of understanding the ethics of care and also the entanglement with more than human others, which is slightly different, I think, than, or at least it's additional to what you were saying. And I listed a whole range of feminist thinkers, I mean, that were different from yours. So I was just sort of interested in how those kinds of worlds were speaking to one another. But you see the issue of how to listen, and in these sorts of forums. So I hope that when we have the workshops, we'll be able to talk about those convergences and differences, because I think at least my intervention was trying to sort of push us outside a bit all the important facts and expertise, and to get a bit deeper into, well, how are we going to survive? And for me, the COVID experience really taught me a lot, along with others, that it is possible to change things, and that I was thinking that this was a major issue that the whole world could, at one point, this idea of a possibility to really make change. So that's why I was trying to give an example of COVID as ways in which these manifestos that emerge from different women's movements and other movements were really hopes or possibilities that sometimes you don't see in the statistics and the doom scrolling that we're all part of. So I think that's what I was trying to get into conversation with. But I mean, this is what transdisciplinary is about, right? So using humanities as well as using biology and sciences and medicine. It's how to talk across, I think, is also very important.
Perfect. We have questions.
Well, thank you. I had a question for you, Professor Harcourt. Thank you very much for the speech you gave. I think it's a very interesting perspective on the topic, and I think it's interesting to also look at disciplines that go beyond scientific, as you say. From what I understood from your speech, in the end, care and community is an act of activism in the world we live today, and are necessary components if we want to reach health, both at a humanity level, but also at an ecological level, at the planetary level. But how do you see that happening in, like, seeing the gap that we have today, that in the sense that we live in such an individualistic society, both at, especially in our countries here in Europe and overall in the global north. And that happens both like in the way we live and at a political level.
Thank you. Yes, I think you've got to the heart of what is difficult. How do we actually change the way in which we're living in the environment, in the place in which we live? I would say that from my experience, there are many people who are having to do that. It's a bit who is the we here, right? So I know that Jason Hickel isn't coming, but I mean, for example, degrowth communities and transition towns and people working with slow food and alternative agroecologies. There are these definitely communities in different parts of Europe who are doing this to resist, but also to live well. I mean, it's not just resistance. So particularly, if I could say, with apologies, but I think younger generations of people are recognizing that the ways in which we've really lived this fast, that's what I was in sort of alluding to, this fast-paced life with no time to care, no time to be with others. I think people are also resisting that now too. So that is about the imaginary. So that if you don't have the imaginary of what's possible, then you won't be able to do it. So for me, because I've worked in international settings, I've learned a lot from the Global South and I think indigenous wisdoms from there, but also people who are not accepting that they are poor and therefore not able to live a life because they're not sitting in auditoriums like this. But actually, they also have a quality of life which we can learn from. And now that starts to sound romantic, etc. But actually, what I think is about listening and learning from those other possibilities. And I'm sure in this room, many people have examples of how you can slow down, live better, live with care at Central, and to be doing that in a dynamic way within the capitalist system, or the capitalocene, or whatever it is that we're now having to understand. I agree with knowledge, and amazing to see from those slides just how much we're kind of, the octopus has kind of engrossed us, but we can push back. That's what I'm saying. I think people are pushing back. So thank you.
Hi. This question is for Wendy, and it's really just to get some understanding into your perspective, because never have I listened to a narrative and felt so much alignment, yet perhaps also felt in some ways excluded from the narrative that you're talking about. And maybe that's because I'm not understanding it. So that's why I want to mention it. Growing up, the idea of a feminist perspective was actually enabling access for women to participate in the capitalist sort of way of life that Western societies have embraced. And so this was somewhat new for me to hear this idea of a feminist perspective that seemed completely opposed to the way that I'd grown up with hearing feminism. And so with respect to that, I was hoping that you could perhaps provide more of an explanation into your perspective and the values that you're representing. Thanks.
Well, thank you. What a wonderful comment. And thank you very much for reaching out. And I'm taking note that you felt excluded. That's not, of course, intended. I in fact, at the beginning, tried to explain that feminism was not about including women in the capitalist system, better jobs, votes for women, better bank accounts or whatever. It was, I mean, this is a long conversation that maybe we could start. But for me, it's about a way of thinking and a way of opening up possibilities by centering care, the ethics of care, which is not understood as, forgive me for saying this, you know, more women doctors, more women nurses being recognized. That's part of it. But it's more how to really, in a way, replace the understanding of modernity is about this homo economicus, and it's actually about putting care at the center. I'm sure that's not helping explain anything. But what I could just say is that feminism for me is, at least the way have lived it for decades by now, is just because of my age, is the ways in which we have to change relations with each other, that we have to not judge people by the biological way they are, in that sense, the gender that they are. And that includes, and I'm not just speaking about men, but also other genders, right? So recognize there are different genders, and this notion of feminism to be open to relating to people, but also relating to others. So it's much more than economics. It's about culture, it's about society, it's about this imagination, which is really shaping a very different world. So of course, you and anyone in this room would be included. But it's not that feminism is an ideology which is saying you must do this or that. It's a set of conversations across very different places, different times, different generations, and it's different genders in that sense as well. So I hope that gives you, well, maybe probably confuses you more, but maybe opens it up a bit more. And I can say this to everybody, those of you who are interested, and I'm delighted that someone is interested. There's so much, and there are so many amazing feminists who are writing, who are speaking, who are engaging in different levels in communities, in academia, but also around where you are, to start reading, thinking, understanding it as an opening, as a possibility, and as fundamental change amongst relationships amongst each other, but also with humanity. So it's not with more than others, more than human others. Does that help at all? I can't look for you in the break?
So one last thing. Why is it called feminism?
I think for historic, I'm looking, come on, feminists in the room, you can help me out here. Historically, it is about bringing women into the economic system, into society, to recognize who they are from in a Western sense of feminism, right? But I think what we're talking about is complicating it a lot more by seeing that it's not just about white liberal kind of dreams, it's about many other imaginaries. So feminism, I'm a generation where to speak about being a feminist was a radical thing. It's probably now a sort of passé thing. But I still hold on to feminism, right? I'm looking a few nods somewhere, no? One nod here, one nod there, but good point, thank you.
Hello, I'm Giuseppe. I have a question for the two speakers. It's about transdisciplinarity. We know that there is a historical trend towards further specialization and fragmentation in the university, even in methodological terms. Now you're a qualitative or you quantitative, and you are focused on these needs, and you cannot escape from that. How can researchers, even students, perform transdisciplinarity in this environment, or how we can change university or academia to move it towards this end? Thank you.
Well, I guess this again takes time to have a good reflection. But the first thing in my view is that we need awareness that disciplines help and specialization helps, and at the same time hides or makes very difficult to understand things, right? So awareness and something to change the conversation of what happens in universities, for example, or institutions, is crucial. In order to do that, there must be, I guess, many open spaces to reflect on these things openly, and not just methods. I mean, today there is like a disease, method, data. Yeah, fine. But this is not going to be very helpful to explain many things. I mean, in science, we know very well that we need theories and good theories. This is crucial. And there is a lack of this kind of debates in many ways. Then we need the spaces and we need time. Everything goes so fast that we need to do something. We need to make a publication. We need to get the data. We need funds. Everything goes so fast that it's against what I'm saying, with some exceptions maybe. But so that's part of the story. So we need to create these spaces. But I guess the first thing is to have this awareness, also including other types of knowledge. Because knowledge and science is very artificial, very artificial. Other kinds of knowledge. Depending on our objective, we need to integrate the voice of workers, the voice of women, the voice of indigenous people, the voice of everyone, Depends. It depends on the topic. And having said that, of course, I don't want to say that goes back to a previous comment, that just with this knowledge we are going to change everything. We need also to include other ideological and political perspectives in the generation of this knowledge. Otherwise, we are not going to do a very good job in order to create this, these imaginaries, this hope, this kind of situation in which we need to help to change things.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the, I agree with what was said, but one of the things I've seen, and I dread to think that this is now ended, is these sorts of conferences and programs that have been funded by the EU. I was part of a project that was transdisciplinary, with a lot of funding for PhDs. I've been parts of this cost action groups, which have also been transdisciplinary. So I think there has been a support for it, not within maybe all universities, but people outside understanding the need for these conversations. I'm plug over here to the people that are funding these things is to keep funding them and to not go for the experts, but to go for these dialogues and conversations. The institute that I'm part of, the International Institute of Social Studies, began from that. It's 75 years old, but we have a very interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary way of thinking. But I agree that exactly, because it's become so competitive, so especially for early career people, they have to publish in certain journals, etc. So I would say there's a resistance that has to happen within the university to push back, and for funders to really look for that much more large and flourishing ways of being relevant to the world, because the world is not in disciplines, right? I mean, look at how we have to understand economics, the politics of it, the different, I mean, also different realities depending on where you live. So very good question, but I'd say it's also for all of us in universities to push back and to see that as part of the politics, and the dialogue and knowledge and across science, hard, soft, whatever way you're going to see it is very important. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. I think we have still time for a couple of questions. There are many.
Hi, I have a question for Wendy. So we all agree, I think, that interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity are good things and we want to do them. But from my small experience, when I've been in contexts where I try to speak with people from other fields, I'm a sociologist, multidisciplinary scientist anyway, and especially in cases where we had people from the community as part of a project or a discussion, I think there's an assumption that we know how to do it. We know how to speak with people from other fields, from other sectors outside academia. And there is little space for reflection about how we do it. And I'd like to ask, from your experience, how we can open the discussion about care in this particular context, and what kind of capacities we need to cultivate as researchers. I cannot speak from another position. What kind of capacities do we need to cultivate in order to take care of ourselves, of others? Because there's all these different dynamics in power, people coming from different places. How do we navigate that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And indeed, this book I've written called Conundrums of Care is really to that. How do we open up the spaces, and with whom and how? But I think we pay attention to the power and that we know is in the academe, and how to, as I said, I mean, the power and the politics of what's in academe. So to also have deliberate and intentional ways of working with community, aware that we're also a community, right? And the words we use, the theories we use, we are so important. Try to explain that to a community. Sometimes you can't, in ways that, you know, in 2 words, if I'm talking about intersectionality, for example, most people in the room are going to go, oh yeah, right. Go to a community, they absolutely understand the concept, but it's not a term that you would ever use, right? So I think it's also paying attention to that and not coming in with the I'm the expert, I'm the researcher, but more I'm part of a conversation that needs to really evolve. Now that takes time, that takes reflection, it takes really working with communities, being part of communities. So I think it's breaking down a bit the hierarchies that we inevitably have sort of positioned ourselves as just because of the way academia operates. So for me, that's also, if you like, this feminist methodology that we use. And one of the products of this was called WeGo, Wellbeing, Ecology, Gender and Community Network. We produced a book called Feminist Methodologies, which spoke very honestly about and candidly about how we conducted methodologies differently or otherwise. So very good question, but it's something that I think to take to heart, right? Because there's no way just publishing in an academic journal we're going to change anything. So we need to be very clear that our responsibility is to, if you like, translate, but also be part of conversations, which also then might change what academia offers. And I think this is exactly what this conference is trying to do. So thank you for the question.
Okay, we have time for, I think, three more questions. So there's one here, there was another one back here.
Yeah, shall we take them all together, the questions, and then...
Thank you so much. This question is for Joan. I think that I like very much your presentation. It's a case of what global neoliberal capitalism has achieved. And it's definitely one of the contributors to the situation we face now of pre-extinction is a possibility through global warming and nuclear war. I would like to ask you, what do you see what the EU can do in this context to favor a world that's more egalitarian, especially being realistic? Europe has dysfunctional politics, is very much for war, even if there is no reason whatsoever for I mean, the British Prime Minister, Stammer, looks more delusional to me than Trump. Seems to be in the 19th century still, as if he was the British Empire. What do you think are the answers that to the action that can be effective? Europe, after all, has major contributions to human welfare. For example, social democracy. They could advise many emerging countries rather than try to fight them or colonize them with or without the United States, to achieve the levels of redistribution that Europe is famous for. That's just an example. And I would like to know your opinion about that specifically. When I would like to comment that in the use of intersectionality in Europe, unfortunately, it's used in a way in which Black women are not centered. And I don't think this is right. It's a concept in which working class Black women started. So I don't know if it could be used without at least making reference to them. And anyway, and well, of course, Silvia Federici doesn't do that. So Joan, that is the question. The Leninist question. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Carlos. Not easy to answer this question because, you know, I will need a lot of time, I think, to reflect on many aspects. Maybe a couple of quick thoughts. Certainly, we live in a very difficult situation globally. That's for sure. I mean, just take the boundary limits, 6 out of 9 or 7 out of 9, you know, trespass, you know, climate change and many others. But it's not only that, it's also many social aspects in which Europe partially has been preserved in comparison to other parts of the world. That's true. But the precarization of life we are seeing everywhere and the commodification goes together with something that Marco Deramo called the privatization of brains. And that's a little bit what we are experiencing in many cases in the populations everywhere. That includes Europe. So that's one aspect. If we understand how Europe developed with the help or through the resources and materials that were stolen from many other countries globally, right? For example, UK developed with the help of, or with the robbery, let's say, of India in many respects. The problem I see in the case of Europe is these waves of neo-fascism, whatever we call extreme right wing. This is growing and growing and growing. And here the battle, I guess, is for democracy. And the only way that, you know, to get a more democratic European Union is through the people, right? Through the movements, through the sovereignty, through the populations. But in order to do that, we have this, I put it a label, privatization of brains, but we can call it in other ways. It's the cultural battle we need also to develop, which is also a political battle, right? Okay, that's it for now, because maybe we can continue. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Shall we take the 2 questions that were left together, and then the panelists will answer and do the final words? Over there, do you want to? Is there a microphone around?
No, I think it's my turn now.
Perfect.
So yeah, thank you very much for the presentations and the discussions that we are having. I think it's very exciting. And what I've been thinking about a lot during this session is about the concept of transdisciplinarity and what disciplines we are always including in this concept. And something that I thought today, it's that I feel that we don't talk much about education and pedagogy when we talk about transdisciplinarity, and also about the fact of how we communicate the knowledge that it's produced. So in any of the conferences that I go where we talk about transdisciplinarity, and I think also the fact that somebody here was asking about feminism and these different ways of understanding feminism also brings, again, this idea of how much we need to think or rethink ethics and values and actually the root of all this knowledge. So basically my question is about like, what's the space of pedagogy and education and also communication of knowledge in this transdisciplinary concept? It's for both, or yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Another question? Yes.
Yes, I was told to be brief, so I will be. Specifically, it's a bit more to Joan, but could be shared maybe. It's about the topic of critical thinking, no, that you were addressing. I would say that we have a profound crisis of critical thinking, in a social level, you know, but also in universities. Maybe it's interesting to focus on that because we are in a university now, and I don't know what are your reflections about this, but I think that like having the space to develop, to share, but also to be actors of critical thinking in university spaces is getting more and more difficult for a structural, for sure, concerns about the neoliberalism schemes, but also for a new ethos, I think, in the origin of, I don't know if you find this valuable, but I think that objectivity is being confused with neutrality, no, and neutrality in the worst ways, and at the same time precarization, no, who makes actually we as persons, people who work in the university, a bit deactivated, no. So if you want to share some reflections about that, I will be grateful.
And thank you for the talks. I also want to be very brief, just something that I think is related to what both of you talked about. To make real change, we need grassroots movements. What are ways in which we can try to mobilize people to have more real grassroots movements or nourish the grassroots movements that appear by themselves? Thank you.
Professor Harcourt, please.
Okay, well, thank you for all those interesting questions. Just to clarify, when I was using intersectionality, I agree that came from the Black women's feminist movement, Kimberly Grinshaw, and you do have to reference that. So thank you for your comment. I appreciate that. And I do agree it's been taken as a sort of toolkit in the European policy context, which is very unfortunate. So I hear that and appreciate that. Pedagogy, as I've just spent some years now in trying to work out what is a pedagogy for an international set of students of different ages, from postgraduate students. It's been something I'm very conscious of, and I see it as a politics of disruption of how people have come in thinking that academia is to teach them how to be experts and how to work more with their realities and do a sort of unlearning or unmaking of, particularly I'm teaching in critical thinking, by the way, in development studies. So I think there's a lot of important understanding of what is pedagogy within the university, which is being discussed, talked about as part of this transdisciplinary discussion. Paulo Freire was mentioned there, but Bell Hooks is somebody that I, as a feminist pedagogic thinker, I think I've sort of learned a lot from her, and also from, anyway, that may be just enough for that as we're running out of time. The only thing I could mention is that with AI and Generation Z or whatever, or Z, how we say it here, completely difficult to get people to read. It's just how it is. So using podcasts, exactly what was done by Juan, using the videos, you have to teach and be very different in how you communicate. So I think it's a really important question, not just within universities, it's also within how you reach communities. Yeah, I could go on about that because I think that's a major issue. In terms of critical thinking, I just also point out feminists have been involved in critical thinking in many ways. I think they've done some profoundly important things in terms of situating where knowledge is produced, how it's produced, where it's produced in different spaces, including these kinds of spaces, but also in communities, and recognizing that often critical and important knowledge and wisdom comes from outside the university, and how to link those different places of we've been using the word wisdom at the moment, but that to me is very important. And that's why I'd really caution the idea that we have to mobilize grassroots. I think that's something that we have to really not be doing. We need to be part of something, part of campaigns, work with, learn from, be the grassroots. I mean, we're not, and then not be studying and extracting what's going on from them, but rather, as I said, there's the politics of the university that we're part of, and then there's the places we live. We don't live in the university. We live in places. We live in places which are changing. Barcelona, I was just noticing, no car zone, fantastic. That's because communities have lobbied for it and making changes for it. So I think let's not romanticize grassroots. It's about survival and change. I'm not critical. I think it's a really good question, but I would just say, let's be aware that there's no role for us to go out and make it happen. We're part of it, and we should be part of it. And we should be reflecting and working and changing our ideas, and not taking from anybody else. I mean, that to me is really important politics of how we do research if we want this transition, which I gather that's what's inspiring you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Last comments and answers.
They are great questions, and I guess the time to answer or to reflect on them is very limited, but just few things, I guess. In terms of transdisciplinarity, okay, there is a lot of rhetoric. Everybody uses interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. Yeah, it's like to say this is natural or this is democratic. Again, the thing is not to talk about this, is to do things that really are transdisciplinary, and in specific ways. It's not just, and I try to do that in my speech, I try to say something about this. It's not just transdisciplinarity here, what matters is critical transdisciplinarity, right? Critical, heavy transdisciplinarity, especially with the example I put with planetary health. So we need to put together all the disciplines, knowledge necessary to understand, to really understand what's going on, to describe very well what's going on, and to explain. And the explanation very often is connected to power issues, macro power issues, micro power issues, including feminism, sexism, many things, right? So that's one thing. So take, for example, economics. The majority of economics that is explained, in my view, it's useless, completely useless. It's worse than that. It's just creating knowledge that confuses, in many respects, what's going on in terms of economics in the world, right? So we need to criticize that, right? The mainstream. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we need to also develop, in terms of pedagogy, it was mentioned, education, but that means political education and critical political education, right? That includes knowledge, technical issues, and at the same time, this ethical, ideological perspective of the world and cultural issues, etc. So we need to treat students as adults, not like children, like many often seem so, right? So speak about it, talk about it, discuss about it. Now, about critical thinking, yeah, certainly there is a crisis of critical thinking, in my view, in many places, including certainly universities. We need to challenge the mainstream. You know, we need to give space for discussion. In my case, for example, when I'm in class with the students, I have a lot of time just to talk about it. Not to make exercises all the time, etc. Just to talk, to reflect, to maybe people are saying nonsense. It doesn't matter. You know, it's a way of developing your brain. And because today we have this crisis of attention, right? As we know, you know, with a mobile phone, I mean, this is getting worse and worse. And finally, well, you know, the last one even is more difficult to mobilize grassroots movements. I mean, knowledge is one thing. Politics is extremely complicated, extremely complicated. We need to be very humble about it, very humble, because in order to change things, it's not just making an assembly or something. No, we need the strategies, and actually we lack strategies very often. All kinds of strategies together in combination. But what we know is that we have this, culturally speaking, this Tina thing that Margaret Thatcher made very famous, right? There is no alternative. And actually, for many people, it seems there is no alternative. There is no future, right? Yeah, and there is, it has been created a collective fear among many people, sometimes even maybe unconsciously. So we need hope. But in order to have hope, history teaches us that how to create hope and change things for better through activism. And how to do that? Well, with collective action, and how to put together all these people when we don't have maybe factories like in the past, and the creation of unions, etc. All of this requires a lot of thinking, a lot of strategies, again, in order to really regenerate this democratic movement that needs to be created, this alliance of forces against these waves of neo-fascism that we are experiencing, not now, I mean, but today is growing and growing. Anyway, just few thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Benach, Harcourt. Let's move to the coffee break, if it's fine for you. I would just say a big applause.
Thank you so much to all three of you for such insightful reflections and comments. I really loved what you said as well about we don't need to create social movements, we need to be part of them. I think that's such an important point. So thank you for sharing that. So I'm after the really powerful and interesting session one. I'm now pleased to invite Nicoletta Dentico and Antia Castedo for the second session of the conference. This session will explore possible futures of health and health equity in the current socio-political climate and the impacts that the eco-social transition could have on health. I regret to share that, unfortunately, Jason Hickel cannot be with us today due to illness. He sends his apologies to Antia, Nicoletta, and to everyone here. We're really sad that he can't be with us, but well, we're just talking about health, so health is something that we can't control, as we all know. So this session will be moderated by Antia Castedo, Senior Researcher of the Institute of Health Equity at University College London. Without further ado, Antia, so thank you so much for moderating the session. Thanks.
Welcome everyone to this second panel of the conference titled A World of Polycrisis, Reimagining Planetary Health and Health Inequities in an Eco-Social Transition. I think we all agree that humanity faces many serious challenges, immense pressure on our natural resources, war, increasing wealth inequalities, profound transformations or evolutions of the capitalist system, to the extent that some people like former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis has proclaimed the end of capitalism, replaced by what he calls techno-feudalism. The changes in labor markets by the use of digital technologies and artificial intelligence. We have the far right approaching power or already in power in several countries. And all in all, is increasing health inequalities between countries, but also particularly within countries. I don't know if you've heard this, but normally when we talk about inequities, we're referring to inequalities that are preventable by reasonable means. And I think what we want to talk about today is about how to precisely prevent those health inequalities and how to transform the world in a way that doesn't generate further inequities in health. So Nicoletta Dentico is going to talk about the future of health, challenges and opportunities on the eco-social determinants of health inequities. She's a global health policy analyst, journalist, and writer. She leads the Health Justice Program at the Society for International Development and co-leads the Geneva Global Health Hub, which is an independent civil society platform that advocates for global health justice. She focuses on the nexus between politics, economic power, and health for advancing global public health and health justice. So, Nicoletta, without further ado, she's gonna talk about all these very important issues and give us a presentation, and then we can have a discussion and ask as many questions as you like.
Thank you very much, Anthea, and thank you very much for inviting me to this session. It was a surprise for me at the beginning of the year to receive this invitation because it actually collides with the week of the World Health Assembly, which has been my idiosyncrasy over the last 20 years and more. So there was this kind of thought, shall I go there or shall I not? I mean, shall I do the business as usual or no, I'll break it. And I did break it. And I'm very happy that I have broken it. So I'm really happy to be in this new community that I'm kind of not very knowledgeable about yet, but that I find a very inspiring, provocation in the sense that it provokes me, but it also leads me to action, thinking differently with new people. So I'm really full of gratitude for not just inviting me here, but also for allow me to come back to Barcelona after quite some time, which is always an awesome landing when you arrive in the city. It's always so beautiful. I will try also maybe to introduce a third modality of, knowledge sharing or presenting things. It's a bit of a mixed of others and a very hybrid, because I'm a hybrid person by definition. I have studied literature and I started with disarmament and landed then in health policies, but I'm not a technical person by any means. However, I believe health is too serious a business to leave it to the doctors or to the pharmacist or to the biologist, and citizens, people, women have to take it on board again. But I would really also start by thanking publicly Stephanie, I already did it individually, for actually, right from the start, providing this kind of ticking of the clock of the unnecessary suffering and the unnecessary deaths that are preventable and that should always be in the back, but also in the front and in the two sides of our mind when we work, when we do things, when we speak, when we are with others. So I would like to sort of give my positionality in the way that I want to make this presentation through the eyes of one of the pictures, the fantastic pictures that were in the room where we had our break. The eyes of this little Dalit girl from Benares, whose eyes are just on me to say, be careful what you're saying, be careful the way you're saying it, and do as the person you are and the role that you have, do make sure you're taking the responsibility, the full human responsibility for the things that you're saying from her Dalit perspective. So I'm just flying from this place, Geneva, because I did go for a few hours. I did go, of course. I had to bring it here. I'm just coming from the triumph, just before taking the plane, the hours of jubilation in the World Health Assembly, because finally there was this rather explosive beginning on the first day, the agreement and the not so easy acceptance of the pandemic treaty. A very kind of interesting process, multilateral process. It's a bit of a pity that I had to spend 3 years of my life on it, but because I have a lot of perplexities on the pandemic treaty myself. But of course, the jubilation, I think, is also a bit of a sense that even delegates, member states, ministers of health, the so-called policy makers, they are so lost and really trying to grab anything they can to give a sense of what they're doing, giving a sense of not just self-preservation, but also the preservation of the public institutions, of the intergovernmental exercise, the multilateral game at a time of such terrible fragmentation, coming after 5 years to basically have what is, it's important to say, a preliminary draft of a treaty text that is not yet finished, because now the most difficult part will start, Article 12, on how you actually guarantee access to the pathogens and the benefit sharing, which brings us to the same usual war of access to knowledge, sharing knowledge, pluralizing, decentralized venues of knowledge and innovation, instead of having, in contrast or in a very sharp tension with these monopoly rights that are the intellectual property rights applying to medicines as they apply to cars, as they apply to any other appliance or instrument or good. So this is, it's interesting because it's actually on a razor's edge, as my friend Preeti Patnaik from the Geneva Health Files has called them. And this picture, however, brings us back to exactly 5 years ago. COVID was mentioned many times in previous presentations, but I want to go there with some of the reality pictures that we seem to have completely forgotten, completely left aside. From this corpse in Bolivia in the streets, from the 275 million that in 4 hours had to leave their places in India because they announced a lockdown for hours before they enacted it, to the nurses and the people, the caretaker, the caregiver, and the health workforce in Italy, when at that moment Italy was the hotspot of the, not yet a pandemic, but it was the hotspot of the infection and the contagion, to the situation of Kenya, where, like in several other African countries, the lockdown and the disease and all the security measures were actually used to, but this didn't happen in Africa only, it happened all over the places, to actually get rid of dissidents, do away with those groups that are more radical or idealist, you name it, or the ones that don't always digest and eat the narrative, that official narrative that is administered on everything practically. So let's try to go back, because you're young, you're all very young, but you were there too. We were all in this, as it was said. And the fact is that, if we try to dig into this COVID-19, I think there is we can classically talk about a BC, before COVID-19, and a AC, after COVID-19, because COVID-19 in many ways has been a watershed. It still is a watershed. I think, in a way, even the first picture that I showed you and the diplomatic process that surrounded the pandemic treaty, I denominated a kind of a long COVID, where many of the COVID syndromes or the COVID effects are still very visible. They're still very impactful and impacting the interaction between governments, global north, global south usually, governments and civil society, for the first time kicked out of the negotiating rooms of the WHO. We are out. They had to create all the sort of fake moments of democracy, fake democracy exercises, to try to pretend that they include us and they include the people that study all the time about, specific issues that are related to the pandemic agreement. Anyway, it was a watershed moment. What it was a moment of unexpected glory for many of those corporate giants that were presented before. We were talking earlier about the food giants, the big food. Now, I think we can, when talking about health, you find them all. But I would like to kind of highlight the problem of the big tech in this case, because, of course, COVID-19 has indeed accelerated a very strong push towards digitalization globally. And, of course, it has pushed digital capitalism, which is now more and more swallowing all the resources of this planet and its people, starkly visibilizing the underlying inequalities and injustices that were already there before COVID-19 in the global economic paradigm. When one of the many slogans, but not very many, a couple of them that kind of, keep coming and coming, it's building back better. In fact, the back was the problem. So we can't build back. It's kind of against nature to build back. You build forward in case, and you have to really change because the back was the problem. Or maybe this idea of leaving no one behind. In 25 years, in 20 years actually, the world has had the 3 global crises whose lessons have not been really learned. The first was, of course, the crisis of the attack on the Twin Towers and what it created in terms of the war on terrorism. Then, of course, we had the financial crisis in 2008. And it was a crisis like the one of the Twin Towers in the Western world, in really the capitals of the empire. And this crisis was not created in the developing countries, in the low and middle income countries. It's actually a crisis coming from the center of the empire. It trickled down, of course, in the global south, but it was generated in the north. It was a first global financial crisis. It actually created so many effects that we're still paying, that is also the long effect of that crisis. And we have learned nothing out of those two crises. So the idea of this pathogen is actually that it took our respiratory tract. And I found in this such a strong metonymy, such a strong thing that we could not breathe. The pathogen was there to tell us that we were not breathing well before its arrival. Unfortunately, this has created a lot of opportunities for the big techs, which has actually used in a very merciless way also this opportunistic moment during the pandemic, consolidating their market dominance and placing their centrality right at every geopolitical negotiation. Of course, with a lot of externalities, negative externalities, with a lot of ethical implications, with huge governance implications. And I think that when we talk about the future of health and health rights, not considering health in isolation, because I don't like to consider health in isolation, I think we really need to address seriously, I see many of you are here as students, as young researchers, what I call the hardware, not just the software, but the hardware of a system that after COVID has, I think, accelerated is dysfunctional and its disruptive effects very fast. Now, let's get a bit of a 5-year time lapse of the forgotten lessons. There has been while the production of lessons learned, you have the UN, the individual agencies of the UN, you have the World Bank, you have the IMF, you have WTO, everybody has produced lessons. Quite kind of banal in most cases, but at least if those banal lessons had been kind of followed or abided, that's not even the case. But I considered, as you may have noticed, the pathogen our best option, are really ruthless in many ways, but very rational pedagogue. I'm very inspired by what Boaventura Sousa dos Santos wrote during the pandemic. This is the pedagogy of SARS-CoV-2. We rediscovered that public health was important. We rediscovered that health is not, the economic performance and the economic values in health, but health was the human right, the dilemma between life and death that actually enticed health workers from all over the world to throw themselves into the ontology of their profession, this really vitality of their profession. And they went to hospitals, they went to bring assistance to people practically naked. In most cases, they didn't have masks, they invented things to protect themselves, but that was not necessarily the main concern. The main concern was to save lives, to restore life where death was threatening everyone. So we really understood again the value of health, the value of the human right to health. Let's not forget, maybe you're not necessarily aware, that the right to health was the first institutionalized and constitutionalized right after the Second World War. With the ashes of 2 world wars, 2 genocides, 2 nuclear bombs in 1 week on the same country. Basically, the surviving policymakers, those who had to take these ashes and make something out of it, they didn't know where to start, and they actually started from health. Because health, whatever you've been in those tragedies, health actually recognizes you as a person and in your dignity. So health, the right to health was conceptualized and used and enshrined in the first UN agency, which is the WHO, in 1946. And it entered into force in 1948 with the entry into force of the WHO as the first constitutionalized human right. The Declaration of Human Rights came months later, and it is not even a binding thing, whereas the Constitution of the WHO, which has the right to health enshrined in its first article, made it an obligation for those governments. And of course, I'm not saying that it has a supremacy on other rights. No, I'm not saying this. But it actually, it was used as the first, as the threat through which you could actually create the canvas of the human rights agenda that was to come. And actually the first right through which you could mend and actually, tie together again societies that were completely broken. Now, naturally, these concepts have been lost. I mean, I'm talking to you here, but if I said anything like this somewhere else in many of the health environments, they would just take me like a lunatic. I mean, what are you talking about? Because now health has become a great market. And the reasoning is to make an investment case for health. That's the logic of it. During the early months of COVID, we discovered that it was what it is, a human rights, a fundamental human rights. It has to do with dignity. It has to do with, now it's clearer than ever before that our human right to health cannot be dissociated from the health of animals, from the health of the ecological health, and we are all interconnected. But certainly it is, when it comes to humans, the social protections, which is actually built through solidarity, cooperation. If you read the preface of the Constitution of the WHO, I think those 2 pages are one of the most beautiful elaborations of this notion of what came out after the tragedies of the first half of the 20th century. But exactly 5 years ago, in these countries, all private hospitals were nationalized. And this idea that we could go back to things that seemed absolutely incredible, impossible, the nationalization? Yes, because we also discovered that private hospitals were totally useless for dealing with the emergency, because private entities in this fundamental human right domain, they don't seek human dignity, they seek profits. So they were pretty useless in dealing with the emergency, and the same happened elsewhere. In my country, there were 213 new entities that were relaunched, that were publicly relaunched to face the catastrophe that was happening in Italy in those months. And as you know, Italy is known for its being bureaucratical, slow-paced, but in a few weeks they managed to set up more than 200 entities that were actually working for the common good. We also discovered that humans are one small yet extremely fastidious animal species, one of the many animal species, correlated, as earlier said, with all the other species in nature's ecosystems. We saw dolphins in the Channel of Venice. We saw all the other species coming out as we were withdrawing and closing the lockdown. But nature taking back its spaces as the sapiens were withdrawing into their lockdowns. And yes, we are all in this. The Pope Francis said we're all in the same boat. Well, I don't think we were all facing the crisis, but certainly we were not on the same boat. Some had yachts, some had sailing boats, some had rubber boats, some had a piece of wood, some had to swim, and some could not even swim. So it actually, the management of the pandemic revealed all the old and created new inequities that exploded. And I definitely want to highlight, taking stock also of Wendy's interventions earlier, that looking at this with a feminist eye, you can see how now, 5 years later, this COVID has been a fantastic opportunity for, in a way, patriarchy 4.0 to establish itself, starting from the measures that were taken during COVID. If any employers were to be fired, the first one were women. If anyone had to care with the patients and the people, of course, it was the women that had to do this. So it was a new trend to bring women back to the private spaces. And maybe we can elaborate a little bit more now, the pushback on women's rights that this entails internationally and institutionally. And of course, the pandemic wounds remain open now. They are still very much bleeding, I think. Despite this sense of removal, we have, basically, we don't think, we don't discuss, and we don't elaborate about this. It's 5 years, it seemed 50. Of course, health systems had to face the crisis. They are in shambles now. A recent report of the WHO published in December of last year demonstrates that already in 2021, so while the crisis was still going on, health expenditures started to diminish again. The fact that health is a political choice, the people were already reorienting themselves to health as something that is marginal in the political choice agenda. Or if it is to be tackled, it is to be tackled according to other lenses, other approaches. Austerity measures were introduced during and after COVID. Actually, the IMF is one of those entities which, like violent men, they ask for forgiveness. They keep on saying, I will not do it anymore, but they keep doing it. And yet they keep on saying, I will not do it anymore. IMF came out saying that the projections were that in 2023, 6 billion people would be under austerity measures. So austerity measures were definitely applied all over the world. And in the recent months and the recent years after COVID, we have seen that instead of regaining and allowing space to social commons like health, social commons like solidarity, even fragility is in fact a social common, because if we perceive ourselves as in our fragility, this changes completely the way we live. We can perhaps give a bit more space to solidarity rather than to competition. But 5 years later, and actually two years later, because in 2022, things started to change completely route with the beginning of a system of warfare. So we have shifted, and we are still shifting from the idea of a welfare system that in this part of the world, in Europe, used to be one of the strengths and one of the elements that has been looked at by others as an inspirational model. We are shifting to a warfare system since the invasion of Ukraine, and of course the multiplying of wars in the world as we see them now. Of course, our attention is mostly on Ukraine and Gaza, but we should never forget, they were mentioned earlier, Sudan and the Republic of Congo, but also there are so many other wars, Yemen, there are around 69 conflicts ongoing, and violence has amazingly increased in the last few years, as the Uppsala report on conflicts tell us. So we are confronted, therefore, with this pandemic treaty in a rather disenchanted world, after all. The new pandemic instrument is, I think, is a missed opportunity in many ways, because it is developed. It has actually been forged as an iteration of the same hyper-medicalized vision of health, a vision that is systematically ignoring the main drivers of zoonosis. So there is really the negligence or the oblivion of any reality, of any sense of reality, of what reality tells you. It's kind of sidelined systemically. And there's no attention whatsoever on primary prevention through non-health policies. There is rather a late-coming notion of prevention that is also very technical, very digital. It's actually all the biosurveillance, is all the datafication, is the control of people and their data and their behavior as well, their pattern of behavior, in order to prevent the spillover. Sometimes, just an autobiographical note, I have to pinch myself when I'm in Geneva, literally, because as was said earlier, sometimes money, financial support goes to projects and to research pathways that to me sound kind of surreal. I was last year in a conference. I have been working a little bit on antimicrobial resistance. My boss is a vet as well, being as an economist. So we used antimicrobial resistance as a kind of a textbook case of the totally unhealthy model of development in which we are. Antimicrobial resistance is actually the fact that we are enshrined in a system where bacteria and fungi and pathogens of all sorts are becoming stronger and stronger, and the instruments we have are increasingly becoming useless to basically face this bacteria. And we don't want to take an anthropocentric vision. We have not taken an anthropocentric vision, this kind of a narrative of the big bugs as our enemies. No, because this is not the reality of things. We rather focus on the biocentric vision of the fact that we are made of bugs. So we are made of bacteria. In fact, the ratio of bacteria versus cells is that we have more bacteria than cells in our body. So bacteria are not our enemies. Anyway, just to go back to this conference in Geneva last year, researchers from France, even in public institutions, were discussing about which animal species to track in Africa, wild species to track, in order to prevent the infection from them to humans. And in countries like Ivory Coast, they have banned already the fact that some people in villages, in rural areas, in remote areas, they eat the meat of the animals that have died in the savannah. And so there is a legal framework that is really being pushed to not eat meat bush, because that is going to be the danger of antimicrobial resistance in Africa. And I basically, suggested humbly that if there is an animal species to follow and to track, is the human species. That's what it is. I mean, that's what we have to track. You are asking yourself how to use AI and digital systems to follow the elephant, to follow the giraffe. I mean, are you joking? But that's exactly the level of the conversations that are held in Geneva and the projects that are funded. Just to say how far we are in this room from this analysis, okay? There is no transdisciplinary, no intersectoral lens in the new instrument negotiated at the WHO. My personal opinion, as a person that has followed it since the beginning, I mean, even before it started, is that the pandemic treaty negotiation is a distraction from the TRIPS waiver struggle that I think we all kind of heard of during COVID, when South Africa and India were asking for the adoption of a rule of international law enshrined in WTO, that intellectual property rights could be frozen for a little while, at least during an emergency. They could be bypassed, they could be waived in order to allow knowledge to be shared and innovation to be, pluralized, to be allowed in different parts of the world. So even within this kind of biomedical perspective, there have been several hijacks going on. And the WHO already has had since 1969 a binding instrument to deal with health crises, including pandemics, which is the international health regulations. But the urge was to create a new tool, a new process. Officially, they said to save the WHO, to save multilateralism. But in fact, it was a kind of a distraction from the struggle on the IP waiver that Europe, particularly, Europe has been the proponent of the pandemic treaty, but Europe stopped. Not even the US were so strong against the pandemic, the waiver, as Europe was. So that's how I would contextualize this process, which you will continue to hear if you're interested in health. Of course, it kind of enshrines immunity as a new ideology and a new organizing principle, I think, to advance health security. And also, as I mentioned earlier, a much more intrusive appliance and application and use of surveillance, biosurveillance for many purposes. The excuse is health security. But since health security kind of easily slides into kind of health militarization, we've seen it in some countries during COVID, and with the militarization of the political discourse that we are being enveloped in, I think there are serious concerns and serious dangers ahead of us. The treaty has heavily been captured by the selfishness of a bare minority of high-income countries and their industrialized complex, with predictable risks of neo-dependency, of new perverse incentives, of course. Well, this is for me an important thing. I think it was mentioned earlier with this, agglomerated interconnections of private sector giants. I think one of the things that we are witnessing after COVID is that I think we are shifting from what we could call a corporate capture into what I define a kind of a corporate governance. Corporate capture was a kind of an earlier stage, and now we are shifting into a dramatic corporate governance, as I see in the WHO and in the official multilateral development circles, the acceptance of several global health initiatives that are public and private partnerships. Legally, from a juridical point of view, these public and private partnerships in the health domain, they have been mostly originated by one place, Seattle, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, one man, Bill Gates, who was the only one ready to tackle COVID-19. And they are all legally private entities. Juridically, they are entities of private law, trade law. They therefore don't make any agreements, any public agreements. They make contracts. Contracts are not visible, not even by the most powerful country. They are not visible. So these institutions, and you have plenty of them, there's a multitude of global health initiatives in health, Gavi, the Global Fund, you have it for multiple of them for each disease, for each approach in the individual disease. There's an army, a legions of these global health initiatives, but only a few have made it seriously during COVID. We should not forget, and I think you should look at this, and in this group should be really working more on this. I just throw it as that for the first time in history, during a health emergency of global dimension like COVID, the international community and the public institutions entrusted the management of COVID, the management of R&D and the development and the delivery, distribution of the vaccines and any other products. But anyway, the management of the entire crisis was given into the hands of public and private partnerships, Gavi, Global Fund, UNITAID. These were the three big ones, which created in the in the ACT-A, which is the accelerator of COVID tools, seated at the WHO, but the WHO had nothing to do with that, actually. It was kind of legitimizing the whole thing. That's why it was seated at the WHO. A super public and private partnership, which is a super monster made of different public and private partnerships together. So we entrusted it to the private sector, into private actors, the management of our crisis, which of course doesn't go. It's an unprecedented scenario, but it doesn't go like this. Now these people are harvesting the, the success. I mean, it was a failure in many cases. COVAX was a disaster, but now they are harvesting the result of this moment. And they are enshrined as member states in the negotiations. They are present, sitting next to countries in the negotiations, and they are the ones who are defining and shaping the route of the pandemic treaty. In fact, you have a lot of voluntary language. It's a binding treaty, but you have a lot of voluntary text. So you do it if you like it. You do it if it is your interest to do it. And we see a lot of there's a new round, a post-COVID round of treaties, plastic treaty, this one, where the multi-stakeholder model says that you have to integrate and involve the corporate sector, the private actors, into shaping the policies. So we have a huge problem. Houston, we have a problem. We have a serious governance problems with that because, of course, this proportion of power and influence shapes things in a way that is not really the most desirable one. So I personally am of the idea that, yes, fine, let's have this treaty, but it won't kind of save us from the next pandemic. It will not be the solution to our problems. And of course, now, 5 years after COVID, we are at what I call a kind of a tipping point. The world seems to have become a kind of a chessboard where powerful hands can pick off pieces faster and more violently than we had thought was possible before. I think earlier, Joan was talking about this acceleration, this kind of speed, this idea that everything has to be decided fast. This is a business model that comes from the corporate sector and that has been, instilled, kind of internalized by policymaking. The idea that this pandemic treaty was to be actually dealt with in 2 years, it's kind of crazy, kills the process. I'm telling my colleagues dealing now with the UN tax convention in New York, that also has 2 years to be kind of, arranged. But can you imagine negotiating a treaty on taxes and economic and financial justice, which is actually the heart of the matter, in 2 years? I know that the US has withdrawn. They are no longer there, but I mean, Europe can be an important spokesperson and spokes entity for the interest also of the US. Anyway, everything's got to be accelerated, and violence is actually come to be accelerated. And basically, we have lost the checks and balances that we used to resort to. Certainly, this is a bit what we see. Genocidal massacres are unfolding through a blatant and shrill breaking of international agreed normative limits. There are no limits anymore. Globalization has been built around deregulation, the abolishing of all limits, removal of all barriers, and this limitless conception that you can grow limitlessly, that you can do things limitlessly, has also, now more and more shaped the wars, and if we can call Gaza a war. And of course, this is the context of the war conflicts, the war scenarios which we see every day under our eyes, but I'm thinking of the violence that is perpetrated against women in Sudan, for example, which is the quintessential distillation of the warfare that the combatants, the soldiers have decided to use. It's in perfect consonance, I think, with the limitless exploitation and spoliations of the planet. The fossil fuel frenzy after COVID has accelerated as never before. But it did not start with Trump, actually. It's of course, Trump has, embodies a kind of a theatrical and mind-blowing way of performing this politics, but it didn't start with him. It actually standard autocratic fare. It's the wild and the long-standing practice of necropolitics, as Achille Mbembe would call them. So there are morphological similarities of disruptions. I'm really inspired by this book by Andreas Malm. I don't know if you've read it. The Destruction of Palestine is the destruction of the earth. We must know that during Biden administration, the US issued a record of 758 new licenses for oil and gas projects, almost as many as the 3 previous years combined. Everyone knows that the continued extraction will bring the catastrophe, and it'll actually accelerate and increase the catastrophe. Yet the licenses keep flowing with the same compulsive limitlessness as the modalities of wars, as the support to the Israeli occupation. There is a limitless acceptance and support of even our European governments to the occupation and the genocide that is going on. So there is a common drive of distraction completely gone out of control. Hurricanes, in the meantime, they tear through the world. Floods inundate Europe and Latin America. They inundate Pakistan. They inundated Libya. Heat waves sear Asia. The tide of climate suffering constantly on the rise, especially in the global south, which has not produced the problem, has not produced the crisis. Internationally codified law that was enshrined in different treaties and covenants after World War II now appear buried by unprecedented violations. I mean, violations were there before. It's not that it didn't happen before. But the level of impunity and violations and the limitless abuse towards institutions. I mean, Israel considers the Secretary General of the United Nations persona non grata. Israel has banned all UN entities from entering Gaza. We've never seen before. We've never seen it to this level. So we are now at what seems to be the first advanced late capitalist genocide. So what do we do here? How about the future? Well, new elements about the present, but also with some projections of the future. Of course, you've heard about the USAID cuts. Very, very brutal, quite obscene, actually. Very quick, accelerated cuts of the lives of millions of people. Here you can see in red all the programs that have been completely dismantled. The green ones are the protection, assistance, and solutions, macroeconomic foundations for growth. There is something left still for HIV/AIDS, but this was a kind of a withdrawing from the first decision, because, of course, AIDS has been one of the key elements of USAID. But it is true that many people with the disease are now completely lost in translation. And not just them, but it is also the people that were looking after the care system that was around HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria is gone. People have been fired. They are not working anymore. And their families are also living the consequences of this, meaning the children cannot go to school anymore because many children above the primary schools in many countries of the global south can only go to private schools because there's nothing much else. This of course, is a disaster in many ways, but it is also true that it was epiphany what happened. It was a moment of epiphany. We have discovered that we had created pretty much of a self-adulating leviathan of international cooperation, USAID. It covered 43% of all the international health cooperation in the world, basically having a monopoly itself. And so the empire is so imperial that not only produces the problem, but it also caters for the solutions to the problems it creates. And it's now clear that it is a dysfunctional system. It was a dysfunctional system. And as this empire, this international cooperation empire leaves the scene, there is a kind of a space that can be created, not for new imperial entities to come on board, but to so many questions that were advocated for before, many questions on how we can definitely project a better scenario for the future. Because the past is what a very important analyst, his name is Osuloni Adei. He is the director of the Health System Resilience Center in the US. He calls the disuse atrophy. Donor countries have willingly actually created an underdeveloped health system in the global south. The decades of being deep-fed on deleterious forms of foreign aid have caused countries and institutions from the global south to wither, just to be, defunded and to die down, even in self-esteem, so to speak, wither in self-esteem, in thinking about their potentials, their capacity, their knowledge that has been so diminished all the time that it's appalling how this manipulation was visible, is still there. Until, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic uncovered the primordial selfishness of the wealthy countries from the global north. Of course, we did not get a TRIPS waiver. No way. We cannot create that precedent that you give the precedent to the fundamental human right to health rather than to the time-bound right of private patents. And also, once the vaccines were available, as you have seen, the global north hoarded the greatest amount of vaccines. In Canada, they had the amount of vaccines to actually immunize people 8 times, 14 times in the UK, 4 times in my country. So, we hoarded them all. And at the end of 2022, only 25% of the population in Africa had access to the first dose of the vaccine. This assuming that the vaccines are the solution to the pandemics, but certainly we did need vaccines at that time. And the figure that I'm giving you, 25% had only had access to the first dose, comes from the director of CDC Africa, the Center for Disease Control of Africa, at the conference in Rwanda where we were discussing about things. So it was clear, and it is still part of the negotiation at the WHO. I mean, this wound, this long COVID effect is still there. Countries from the global south have not forgotten what happened with the global north during the pandemic. Of course, there is a possibility now to see and to denounce and to have an honest conversation about endless cycles of strategically ineffectual foreign aid for basic health services and social protections that have actually infantilized leaders from the global south and absolved them of their responsibilities with their children, with their citizens. This donor kind of logic and the disuse atrophy has prevented countries from the global south from developing their own muscles, from their own ways of looking at things and actually asserting their own institutions, their own policy choices, their own accountability. Of course, there are lots of, we could, on this sentence, we could discuss for ages because, of course, since health is not in isolation, policies in health that are usually the ones harshly hit by conditionalities of the World Bank, of IMF, are the ones that have to be sacrificed for export policies. They are also very much linked to the debt that these countries have. The report of the UNCTAD World in Debt of 2024 says that, of course, 30% of the GDP of countries is overall, on average of the developing countries, is used for not even paying back debt, but the service of the debt. So, of course, during COVID, there were 24 countries in Africa which could not spend more on the COVID emergency than they could do for the debt service. That was not even, of course, not canceled. It wasn't even swapped. It wasn't even relieved. They had to pay. No discussion about this. So, of course, they cannot assert their policies because debt comes first. And we need to discuss debt. We have been trying over the last 3 years to basically, push this kind of slogan. Debt cancellation is a global health issue. Of course, this use atrophy has, in a way, deepened the congenital defects of power dynamics in global health, which have spilled over through foreign aid, bilateral and multilateral, and they have, of course, been exacerbated during COVID, and neo-dependency, forms of neo-dependency have emerged in having to rely on the Global Fund, on Gavi, and their extravagant business models, which have often advanced nonsensical requests for investment cases from all sorts of grant financiers. Now, one of the most kind of fashionable ideas related to the pandemic treaty is that you will have a new round of bonds, pandemic bonds. That's why immunity is an organizing principle, because if you think that everything is a pandemic, you can, proliferate ideas and financialized ideas that create that's what the financial industry relies on. But this is, wow. This is time for a cure of global health. I said many of the things. You can have a look at it because time is going. What is the future of health? And everybody talks about the future of health care. So even those that are thinking about new ideas, they kind of get encapsulated in the same system thinking, health care. Of course we need health care. Don't get me wrong, fine. But health as a positive concept is not just health care. And of course you have these very fuzzy words, inclusive, global, individual, and digital. Yes, it's all, Now, I'm coming to the end. We are here to imagine another future for health. Earlier in the previous session, there was rethink, reimagine. I think we can talk about redefining the issues, reconnect to the reality, repair the damages of public administrations in health that have actually been built according to the diseases. In many countries, you have public health sectors that are compartmentalized according to HIV, AIDS, TB, mother to child, the donor's agenda, not the public health policy administration. We need to regenerate health from its own leviathanic actors and also to reverse the situation. And of course, we need fresh thinking. We need nodes of policy wisdom. It was said before, at the country, at the local, at the country, at the regional, at the international level, but well beyond health policies. This, of course, seriously applies to the continent where we are, Europe, where health risks to be captured again in the current geopolitical upheavals and regressive narratives of defense, biosurveillance, militarization, and I would actually add here, which I need to add, this idea that women's rights and women's health rights have to be recontrolled again. Women have gone too far, have gone too off the handle, and we need to, you have a multiplication of what I call the womb politics. In Hungary, you have to have at least 4 children, at least 4 children to have some fiscal advantages. The same happens in Russia. The same is being discussed in Italy. It's going to be introduced in the US. In India, Modi is actually projecting that from 2050, India will have a demographic decline. And moreover, there's a question that Muslim women make more children than the Hinduist women. And so there is a religious motive to regulate and create womb policies adapted to the Indian context. So we need to really rethink our economic principles to achieve a healthy environment and a more equitable society. It is indispensable to continue living on this earth and to live in a society and in a world that can harbor us still. I mean, we are counting our days, we're counting our years, for the future. But nature is definitely has no problem. It reinvents itself. Nature is much stronger than we are. And I think that this eco-social element, I was in a conference the other day in a meeting talking about land and not war, terra e non guerra. It was a motto of the peasants fighting during the First World War because they did not want to be enrolled in the colonial wars of Mussolini, terra non guerra. And the idea that a decent wage is an ecological issue. It's profoundly an ecological issue because if you give a decent wage to people, they can gain the freedom to think about how to feed themselves, what kind of education to think about. It's an ecological thing. So yeah, today is the Biodiversity Day. We are thinking a lot about vaccines produced by pharmaceutical companies, but we are not really enough thinking about the vaccines of biodiversity, which is actually the one that we have to care for. It's all living around us. It's all interconnected. Yes, health in all policies, of course, but the centrality of food systems. I think if we want to start a future for health, a future for a comprehensive planetary health or One Health, you name it, it's all been created by the same foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. Anyway, that's where all these concepts come from. Whatever, but you have to really gain the centrality of food systems. That's where you start to pull the thread. And public financing for health, however, I think is absolutely crucial, important. Everyone now is talking about innovative financing, blended finance. These are all buzzwords completely full of poison and tricks and perils. We need public funding for a sound, solid planetary health system. I finished. This is my last one. And I want to talk. It was mentioned earlier, so I am very grateful for those who introduced this power issue so much more than me. But I want to finish with this fantastic old man, also Inca. I can define the history of human society, the evolution of human society as a contest between power and freedom. And whether this contest is being performed along ideological lines or along religious lines, ultimately, really, what we have is truth versus power. Truth, for me, is freedom, self-destination. Power is domination, it's control, and therefore a very selective form of truth, which is a lie. The polarity between these two forms, for me, is the axis of human striving in the creation of an ethical society, an ethical community. And I guess reaching that is the purpose of this meeting today, for which I thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta, for your talk and for giving us this assessment of the pandemic accord, this critical view of it from the center of global health power, which is Geneva, and that is quite far away from a lot of us. So thank you very much. I believe we have some time for questions, if there are some, before we break for lunch.
Questions? Thank you so much. That was incredibly powerful, and you've covered so many issues. But I want to focus on the sort of the development of UN treaties and WHO treaties and UN policies. And thank you for your participation. But one of the things I observe is, you mentioned the sort of industrial complex, that industries and high-income countries have so many resources relatively, they can send anyone to cover any of these treaties. But in civil society, I think we have two problems, well, lots of problems, but one is a structural one that we tend to be focused on. I work on obesity, I work on tobacco, I work on this. So then people miss out. They're just not even at the table when the Sustainable Development Goals are being developed. They don't even know that there's a sort of treaty being developed on corporations and human rights, or we just don't even know those things are happening, so we're not there, partly because we're structured wrong, we don't get access to the information, we don't have the resources to have people there. And and then the bigger political economic system is that resources are increasingly shifting to the private sector, not in the public sector. So again, it's part of this vicious circle. So I just wondered, you would have experienced that firsthand. And so what is your recommendation? Because I think these treaties, they take so long, and it can be a huge drain on time. Is our time best spent there, or just ignore that and actually do something closer to home? These are the sort of decisions we will all be juggling in a way day to day. So I just wondered if you could reflect on your experiences and your insights and recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. Very, very complex. UN treaties, yes. I think, as I mentioned, after COVID, there has been a revamping on treaties that it could be welcome. On the one hand, of course, you do want binding arrangements, particularly in the health sector, where there are only two, basically, the Tobacco Convention and the International Health Regulations. That's it. I have spent far too many years into drafting resolutions and pushing for resolutions at the EB, at the executive board, at the WHO. And then you realize that, of course, resolutions are important because they are a tool. Governments go back. They also feature themselves. They produce a resolution. They are, protagonists of some. And also it binds the WHO to do something, basically, to be bound. But resolutions are soft norms, and they are not binding, strictly speaking. So many countries ignore them. Now, these UN treaties are, I see a complete shift in the way treaty making is conducted. I was very involved in the Landmine Treaty. The Landmine Treaty was a movement from below, from civil society, academia, experts, and finally even the ICRC, the military people of the ICRC having to, they're demonstrating that you don't win a war with landmines. You simply devastate a country and generations for decades. So that was a bottom-up push to have a legal instrument, and it had a dynamic of its own. I mean, civil society was also so much more ready to name and shame, to be more, to be stronger, not to be polite. Now, I think we suffer from a syndrome of politeness in the civil society, which is appalling. And you may say, okay, you're old, you can be impolite. I usually try to choose the literary genre that I want to use, but I used to be pretty impolite even when I was 30 or even earlier. So can you imagine now? But this question of being polite, and treaties are now made after the Global Compact in the UN, after this enormously important reform through which you basically compensate the lack of support coming from countries to the UN system through the presence of the private sector, which is not the middle and small industries. It is not the small private sector with whom it is so easy and also very positive to co-create ideas. It is the big giants. It is Nestle and Mars. You have actually in panels, you have Mars giving you ideas about food security. I mean, having had 3 kids, anything that I would do is actually to keep them away from any Mars thing in my personal motherly experience. But that's what happens. You have I mean, in COP, the last COP meeting, you had a multitude of lobbyists coming from that private sector, absolutely in a number that is absolutely superior to the presence of civil society because of what you were saying, lack of resources, or because actually these COP meetings are increasingly happening in countries that are open-handed, open-armed to private sector lobbyists, but certainly if, group of activists, the feminist activists, the young activists go there, they immediately tell you, no, there's no room. So there is a really there's an intention to create an asymmetry even in presence that actually reflects the asymmetry of power. All of these treaties are made with these people because the idea is that we cannot solve the problem without having them on board, which I think is a typical lie, according to what, it's a classical narrative lie. I want to use Soyinka's image. It's a lie. And what does this thing create? After the Global Compact, I think what we see more and more in the name of multi-stakeholderism, I mean, it is like believing in the flat earth, You feel that we are all around the table. So you have the peasant, talking about food, let's talk about food, because in the food arena, you really have civil society, you have the movements, you have the peasants, you have the fish folks, you have, you have the people that do the thing. The health sector, which is by far the most conservative, when you're lucky, you have the patients, which have an organization financed by the drug producers that want the patients to advocate for that drug. That's the level of civil society that we have in the health sector. We don't have movements, really. I mean, we have people's health movement, but it's academic people, mostly, which are I agree with Wendy, academia is part of the movement. It's not something that creates a movement. We are all part of it. But we don't have the masses that you have or the numbers that we have elsewhere. So it's an extremely conservative place where I think the tobacco joke of creating, scrutinizing the radicals, the idealistic, correct me if I'm wrong, it was the pragmatic and the opportunistic, it was these four categories. It's done, it continues and it is there, it is shaped civil society organizations. I'm really, I have to pinch myself again when the Secretariat says, but civil society is not so aggressive anymore. We have become all very technical and very, as you said, very silos. They have orchestrated our existence according to silos. So who does food systems, separate from health, separate from environment, separate from energy, separate from finance, and we are orchestrated like this. On the other hand, our opponents are a greatly organized, structured cartel. In health, we keep thinking that our enemies or our opponents are the pharma sector. But the pharma sector works hand in hand with the food sector and with the chemical industry associated, of course, to the food sector. They work hand in hand with the digital sector and with the financial sector. They are a conglomerate. They think through. And of course, they don't have to take democratic decisions. They are small people, a small group of people. They can decide and make scenarios. And by the way, talking about viruses, they have their variants. They also have their variants. They have the mere corporate sector, the companies, and then they have their social variant, like COVID. It had its variants. And that's a philanthropic group, the philanthropic sector. Foundations that are also private entities, foundations are coming up like mushrooms. I mean, apart from the one I mentioned earlier, these days, the WHO work is orchestrated by the UN Foundation, which was created in 1998. It was the first one, created by Ted Turner, who was scandalized because Reagan had so many arrears to the UN. There was $10 billion that the US had to give to the UN in assess contributions in obligations to pay, and it didn't give, the country didn't give the UN the money. So Ted Turner comes on board. He said, I will do it. I will give the money for Reagan on behalf of the US, because I feel as a US citizen so ashamed that we don't pay the UN. Well, he created a foundation, the UN Foundation, which was regularized, officialized in the UN only in 2015. It started in 1998, and it was officialized in the UN in 2015. It is seated at the Secretary General office, and Ted Turner paid for 3 years. Then he also had a financial crisis, and he turned the foundation into something that now governments pay. You know, it was a metamorphosis. The foundation that was supposed to give the money to the UN, his money, became a foundation from which he gets the money. Now, the UN Foundation has its sister organization in the WHO Foundation. These are all kind of strange creatures, strange beasts. And yes, how do I see these treaties? We need binding arrangements, but I think that instead of continuously creating new binding rules, we should basically implement the rules that we have already that are also pretty much violated. And in the case of the pandemic treaty, I think if we had worked and improved incrementally the international health regulations, as it's been done in the past, we would not have had the confusion, because now if a country is faced with a pandemic, what will be the juridical hierarchy? Will it be the pandemic treaty? Do I have to respond to the pandemic treaty rules or to the international health regulations rules? I mean, I'm lost. And it is not Burundi that is lost. It is not Mali that is lost. It is not Bangladesh. It's Europe that is lost. Europe itself doesn't know what hierarchy to kind of follow in terms of norms. And let's be careful about too many norms, because too many norms also create, this kind of Babel tower effect that is not a desirable outcome, I think.
I believe we have time for one more question, or should we just wrap up for lunch?
Yes, we have time for one more, but if the question and the response could be as brief as possible, please, because we're... Thank you.
I think also your speech today shows how interdisciplinary health is, because while talking about this, you talked about gender inequality, you talked about the pitfalls of humanitarian action, you talked about the pitfalls of globalization. But what I wanted to elaborate a bit more on was the commodification of health and how it impacts governance. You talked about the term corporate governance and how private organizations get to make contract instead of agreements. How does that impact our democracies today? What are ways that we have available to us now to actually change that dynamic and go back to a bit of a more democratic way of making decisions in that regards? And you talked a lot about civil society and how maybe we are less present in the debate now. How could we get back to being more present and taking that space back?
I'll be short. How does it impact commodification of health? Enormously. I invite you to read a sick development report by Oxfam. It tells it all. It enormously deforms health. It transforms and deforms health. So commodification, corporatization, privatization, and I think also financialization. Tomorrow I have brought a bit of propaganda here. It was too heavy to bring all in once. So I'll bring tomorrow the work that we are doing on financialization of health. It's all connected to your commodification. It impacts enormously. The second question is how can we as civil society, I'll try to give a metaphoric answer. Last Saturday, I was with a group of young people, the WHO watchers, people of your age, and we decided to stay underground in a ballroom in a place, La Maison des Associations of Geneva. We actually decided to choose an underground space and a ballroom because, we need to go underground. I think it's no longer the time. I mean, of course, we go to negotiations, we go to places, we follow what is being said. But I think also we can't spend all our energies there. We need to think of places, of alternative spaces that we want to occupy, to strategize, and to think a bit under track. We need to do like, in Europe, the partisans during the liberation times. They were not kind of exposing themselves. They were hiding themselves. I think we need to hide a little bit also to speak certain amount of inconvenient truths also about the role of civil society and go the whole hog, really think through and think long and think this is a moment where we cannot gain anything now. It's a moment of resistance. So this is it's a perfect time to go in a ballroom underground. I don't know if I give you, a response through this. We need to go underground and to just unpack all the mistakes that we also have made and how we can find solutions. Solutions will be long-term. I will not see any of them. There will not be any solution that is going to be visible for me, but history goes beyond my generation that has certainly created a lot of problems to your generations. And I feel the responsibility of passing over my experience into your hands and hoping that we can make it. But history has its own whims as well. Trump, for all its negativity, is also allowing us some opportunities. And who would have imagined on the 1st of December of 1991 that by the end of the same month, the Soviet Union would not be existing anymore? So sometimes history takes some sort of routes that are unexpected, and I'm very much counting on the capacity of improvisation that history has. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta, for sharing with us your experience and your passion.